There exists a photograph from the spring of 1943. It is a grainy, sepia-toned thing, taken aboard a Japanese heavy cruiser somewhere in the vast blue immensity of the Pacific Ocean. In it, a man stands on the bridge in dress uniform, his face composed, his eyes fixed on something beyond the frame. His name was Mineichi Koga, and within days of this image being captured, he would be appointed to command the entire combined fleet of Imperial Japan. Within a year, he would vanish into a storm, and within the decades that followed, nearly everyone would forget he had ever existed at all. How is it that a man can rise to such towering importance in the machinery of war, and then be erased so thoroughly from memory that his name barely registers in the historical record today? That is the question that draws us across the dark water tonight. Imagine, if you would, the Pacific in those years of wartime. The ocean at midnight holds a particular kind of silence, not the absence of sound, but rather its suspension, held in abeyance by the greater darkness. In the anchorages of Truk Lagoon, where Koga would later make his headquarters, the water laps softly against the steel hulls of warships, anchored in neat, geometric rows. Destroyers and cruisers creak in the tide, gun turrets point skyward like sleeping sentinels. The smell of salt and machine oil mingles with coal smoke and the more elusive scent of diesel fuel, the unmistakable perfume of a naval fleet at rest. Somewhere in the tropical darkness, a buoy clangs its lonely rhythm. Somewhere else, a rating walks the deck on watch, the soft pad of his footsteps the only human sound for miles. This is the world that Koga inhabited. This is the sensory texture of his final command. But to understand how a man becomes forgotten, we must trace backward, into the quieter waters of his birth and his rise. And to do that properly, we need to know not only what happened to Admiral Mineichi Koga, but why it is that so few people know his story at all. If you find yourself drawn to the lives of the men behind history's great machinery, those who operated in shadow, who made decisions that rippled across oceans and decades, who were present at the hinge points of war, but whose names were written in smaller print, then I would ask you to subscribe to this channel. We explore the lives of those commanders, those officers, those architects of strategy whose influence endures even in their obscurity. This particular journey into the life and disappearance of Admiral Yamamoto's successor is one such exploration, and it unfolds best when witnessed in full. The moonlight in the Pacific is peculiar at certain times of year. It falls across the water with an almost liquid quality, creating the illusion that the sea and sky have merged into a single, luminous entity. The ships anchored below seem to float not in water, but in a kind of void, suspended between earth and heaven. This image, this interplay of light and darkness, of steel and water, of men gathered together in the vastness of an infinite ocean, sets the stage for our story. For Koga's life was lived in these spaces, between certainty and doubt, between power and helplessness, between remembrance and forgetting. The date we have chosen to begin is the spring of 1943, though the true origins of his story lie decades earlier, in the Japan of the Meiji Restoration, when the nation was girding itself to become a modern power, and young men from the provincial samurai families were being called to build a new kind of navy. Koga was born into such a world, in a place called Saga Prefecture, on the island of Kyushu, in the year 1885. The Meiji era was still young then. Emperor Meiji had been on the throne for less than 2 decades. The samurai class, that ancient warrior aristocracy, had only recently been abolished. Yet the values they had embodied, the emphasis on duty, on discipline, on the subordination of personal desire to collective purpose, these remained woven deep into the fabric of Japanese society. The air that hung over the Saganese countryside in those days was the air of transformation. Old ways were being dismantled, new technologies were arriving from the West. Railways cut across landscapes that had known only footpaths for centuries. Telegraph wires reached toward the horizon, and everywhere, in the consciousness of thoughtful people, there was the awareness that Japan was racing to catch up with the great powers of Europe and America, to modernize itself, before the world could modernize it without consent. Koga's family was of samurai descent. His father had held rank, had lived by the code of honor and obedience that the samurai class had embodied. And though Koga himself would be born into an age when that class no longer officially existed, something of its spirit lived on in him. His family understood that service to the state was the highest calling. They understood that duty was not negotiable, and that a man's worth was measured not by his personal achievements or accumulation of wealth, but by how faithfully he served his larger purpose. For a young man of such background and temperament, the Naval Academy at Etajima presented itself as the natural trajectory. Here was an institution that embodied both the ancient values his family held dear and the modern technical sophistication that Japan needed. Here, young officers were taught both the classical warrior virtues and the mechanical realities of contemporary naval warfare. The academy itself, built on an island in the inland sea, was isolated from the broader world, a kind of monastic space devoted entirely to the making of officers, and it was to this place that Koga would go when he came of age. But before we trace his journey through those hallowed halls, we must pause and think about the larger world into which he was being trained. The Imperial Japanese Navy, in the final decades before the Pacific War, was itself caught between two competing philosophies, two different visions of what naval power ought to be. This tension would shape Koga's thinking throughout his career, and it would help to explain the decisions he would later make and the uncertainties that would dog his command. That story, however, requires its own gentle unfolding, and so we turn our attention now to the broader currents of naval doctrine and thinking that swept across Japan in the early 20th century. The great warships that dominated men's imaginations in that era were the battleships. Massive, heavily armored, mounting guns of extraordinary destructive power, these vessels represented the epitome of naval might. They were called dreadnoughts, and they embodied a particular philosophy of sea warfare, that naval battles would be decided by great ships of the line, engaging one another in direct confrontation, resolving the question of dominance through the sheer force of their firepower. Japan had begun building such ships in earnest in the early years of the century. The doctrine officers were taught centered on the idea of a great climactic battle, what came to be called the decisive battle, or Kesson, in which the combined fleet would engage the American Navy in a single, overwhelming confrontation and win. Yet even as this doctrine was being refined and reinforced, something else was stirring. Aircraft had begun to appear on the naval horizon. Naval aviation was in its infancy, a technology still being understood, still being integrated into the fleet's operations. There were those who sensed that the aircraft might eventually challenge the battleship's dominance. There were those, in other words, who understood that the future of naval warfare might be fundamentally different from the past. This tension between the old and the new, between battleship tradition and aviation innovation, would run through the entire history of the Japanese Navy, right up to and through the Pacific War. Koga, growing up in this environment, absorbing the culture of the Naval Officer Corps, would come to embody something of both perspectives. He was trained in the classical tradition. He respected the battleship doctrine, but he was also intelligent enough to see the technological winds shifting. And this kind of balanced, slightly skeptical intelligence, this refusal to commit entirely to either extreme, would mark his character throughout his life. It would make him, in some ways, a cautious figure, and caution, as it happened, was not always the quality that was rewarded in the Imperial Japanese Navy. The waters are very still now in our imagined anchorage. The moon has risen higher, casting longer shadows between the ships. The men on watch are still at their posts, still maintaining their vigil, and somewhere in the darkness, though we cannot yet see him, young Mineichi Koga is preparing to join their ranks. He is about to embark on a journey that will take him across the oceans of the world, through the ranks of an increasingly sophisticated military institution, toward a position of enormous responsibility and influence. But he does not know it yet. None of them do. History, even for those who are about to make it, is always a surprise. And yet, Standing in that same lagoon just months after Yamamoto's death, there would come another man, a man of quieter bearing, different in almost every temperament from his celebrated predecessor, and chosen precisely because he carried none of the same dazzling reputation that had made Yamamoto such a legend among the fleet. His name was Mineichi Koga, and he would hold the highest naval command in the empire for barely more than a year. He would face decisions as consequential as any Yamamoto had confronted, navigate the same closing waters of defeat, and then, on a moonless night in March of 1944, he would simply vanish. What makes this disappearance so peculiar, so hauntingly incomplete, is that in the 8 decades since that moment, Koga has scarcely reappeared in the popular imagination at all. Ask most people who know something of the Pacific War, something of Japan's naval history, to name the great admirals, and they will tell you of Yamamoto, perhaps Nagano, possibly Nagumo. They will speak of tactics and boldness, and the men whose names have been repeated in books and films and documentaries until they have taken on the weight of inevitability. But Koga fades. Koga is the footnote, the caretaker commander, the figure who sits between the glorious past and the collapse that followed. And perhaps you might wonder, isn't that the exact position where a careful historian ought to look more closely? Because there is something worth examining in that very fading itself. There is a story not only in what Koga did, but in why we have forgotten what he did. In the decades that followed the war, Japan's defeat became enshrined in narratives of heroism and sacrifice, of leaders whose brilliance was undone only by circumstances beyond their control, by the grinding material superiority of American production. Yamamoto fit that narrative perfectly. He was the prophet who warned against the war, even as he prosecuted it brilliantly. The man whose death in combat came almost as a tragic inevitability. There was drama in him, resonance, the kind of arc that invites retelling. Koga, by contrast, inherited a navy that was already fragmenting, already consuming itself. He faced problems that could not be solved by cleverness or daring. His was the lonelier task, the management of decline, the preservation of hope in circumstances that offered less and less reason for it. The transition between these two men marks something essential, though. It marks the moment when Japan's naval war shifted from being a story of tactical brilliance struggling against material odds to being something far more like a slow, inexorable erosion. Yamamoto died, believing the war might still be salvaged, might still find some negotiated conclusion. Koga would command, in an era when that hope, never quite stated aloud, had begun to calcify into something like resignation. To understand him, to understand why he matters, even though we have largely stopped speaking his name, is to understand something deeper about how institutions endure under pressure, how leaders make choices when few good choices remain, and what it means to serve when the cause you have served begins to slip away from all possibility of victory. The story that follows, then, is an invitation into a memory that has grown dim. It is not a story of triumph, nor of the kind of bold, unconventional thinking that captivates popular history. It is quieter than that. It is the story of a careful man in impossible circumstances, a figure who understood duty in a very particular way, and whose life and death illuminate something about the Japanese naval tradition that is often left in shadow. If you find yourself curious about the men behind the headlines, about the weight of command in wartime, about the Japan that few documentaries quite manage to illuminate with full humanity and complexity, then you might find something in Koga's journey that speaks to you. And if so, I would invite you to subscribe so that we might walk through his life together, tracing the arc from a boy born in the Meiji twilight to a commander navigating the darkest waters of the Pacific War. And so, let us begin at the very beginning then, before Koga knew anything of admirals or fleets, or the vast, terrible machinery of modern war. Let us return to the countryside of Saga Prefecture in the winter of 1885, to a family whose roots ran deep into the samurai past, and to the customs and certainties of a Japan that was itself in the process of reinventing what it meant to be modern, to be strong, to be worthy of a place among the great powers of the world. In the spring of 1885, in Saga Prefecture, on the island of Kyushu, a child was born into a world that was already quietly reshaping itself. His name was Mineichi Koga, and though no one in that household could have known it then, this boy would one day inherit command of an empire's greatest naval force at the very moment of its unraveling. But that destiny lay decades ahead, hidden in the mist-covered hills and the patient tides of the Ariake Sea. The Koga family belonged to what we might call the upper reaches of the samurai class, though by 1885, the samurai as a military caste had officially ceased to exist in Japan. The great feudal clans had been dissolved just 13 years before Mineichi's birth. Their swords and their authority alike surrendered to the new Meiji government. And yet, the spirit of samurai culture did not vanish so quickly from the households where it had taken root. In homes like the Kogas, the customs remained. The discipline, the emphasis on duty before self, the notion that honor and loyalty were currencies more valuable than gold. These were not museum pieces gathering dust. They were living, breathing expectations that shaped how a child was raised, how he learned to speak, to move, to think about his place in the world. Saga Prefecture itself carried deep historical weight. It was a region of samurai tradition, of feudal lords who had served and sometimes challenged the shogunate for centuries. The landscape around young Mineichi's childhood was one of striking natural beauty, with mist-shrouded mountains rising behind villages and the sea never far away. The Ariake Sea, one of Japan's largest bays, lay to the east, and its tides were among the most dramatic in the world, rising and falling with a rhythm that could be felt in the bones of anyone who lived near it for long. There is something in such a landscape that teaches patience, teaches the observation of natural cycles, teaches a kind of respectful attention to forces larger than oneself. The year 1885 itself marked a crucial threshold in Japan's transformation. The Meiji Restoration, that extraordinary national upheaval that had begun in 1868, was now entering its adolescence. The traditional structures of Japanese society, the samurai, the feudal domains, the old ways of governance, had been systematically dismantled and replaced with a modern state consciously modeled on Western industrial and military power. But this modernization was not, as it might have been in another nation, a wholesale abandonment of the past. Rather, it was a careful synthesis, an attempt to preserve Japanese identity and values while adopting the technological and organizational methods of Europe and America. This philosophy, this peculiar balance, would come to characterize much of Japan's approach to the world for the next several decades. For the Koga family, and for families like theirs, this presented a particular kind of challenge and opportunity. The old paths to power, the feudal hierarchies, the samurai warrior traditions, were closed. But new pathways had opened, and they required a different set of skills. Education became paramount. Service to the state in its modern bureaucratic and military forms became the avenue through which a family of samurai descent could maintain its status and influence. A young man of good family could now aspire to become an officer in the Imperial Navy or the Imperial Army, could become a government official, could participate in the transformation of the nation itself. Imagine, then, the household into which Mineichi Koga was born. It was a home that looked both backward and forward simultaneously, honoring the samurai code of conduct while preparing its children for a world of steel ships and mathematical gunnery, of international diplomacy and industrial might. The routines of his childhood were likely governed by a certain formality, a respect for hierarchy and order that permeated daily life. Meals would have been taken with attention to ritual and proper form. Education would have emphasized not only academic subjects, but also the cultivation of character, the development of what the Japanese called kokoro, the heart or spirit, the inner dimension that gave outward actions their meaning and worth. The Meiji era itself possessed a peculiar quality of urgency and excitement, especially for families with access to education and opportunity. Japan had, quite deliberately and against considerable odds, avoided the fate that had befallen so many Asian nations in the 19th century. It had not been colonized, it had not been carved up into foreign spheres of influence. Instead, through a combination of rapid modernization, shrewd diplomacy, and the cultivation of military power, it had transformed itself into a nation that the Western powers felt compelled to treat as an equal. This achievement created a certain intoxicating sense of national purpose, of destiny, that must have been palpable in the households where the next generation of leaders was being raised. Young Mineichi, growing up in this context, would have absorbed these currents without necessarily understanding them consciously. He would have learned that duty mattered more than comfort, that service to the nation was the highest calling, that a man's word and his honor were the measure of his worth. He would have learned to read and to write, to study history and literature, to understand Japan's place in the world. The samurai tradition, though officially defunct, lived on in the pedagogy of the era, in the values that parents and teachers instilled in boys destined for leadership. The natural world around him, the mountains, the sea, the seasonal changes that marked the turning of the year, would have been present as a constant backdrop, a kind of silent teacher. There is a Japanese aesthetic tradition that finds beauty and meaning in the transience of things, in the way seasons pass, in the way light changes across water. Whether Mineichi explicitly studied or thought about such things as a child, the world he inhabited was saturated with these sensibilities. By the standards of the Meiji era, especially in the provinces, the Koga household would have represented a kind of ideal. Here was a family of good lineage, adapting successfully to the new order. Here was a place where traditional values were preserved, while modern education was pursued. The family likely had the resources to ensure that Mineichi would receive the best education available, that he would be prepared for whatever role his abilities and circumstances might open to him. And in the Japan of the 1880s and 1890s, the paths most readily open to such a boy led towards service in the military, and particularly toward the Navy, which had become the jewel in the crown of Japan's modernization efforts. The Japanese Navy of this period was still young, still learning, still building itself according to plans and principles imported from Britain and Germany. It represented Japan's most visible assertion of modernity, its most dramatic claim to a place among the great powers of the world. For a young man of promise and proper family background, entry into the Naval Academy represented not merely a career choice, but a calling, a way to participate directly in Japan's transformation and to secure his own place in the emerging order. Mineichi Koga was a boy, then, born into this particular Japan, at this particular moment, surrounded by the values and expectations of his time and place. The rhythms of his early life would have been shaped by the customs of his family, the educational aspirations of his parents, the broader national currents of Meiji modernization. He had no way of knowing that he would one day be called to command the very navy that was the symbol of his nation's modernity, nor could he have imagined the circumstances under which that command would come. The island of Etajima lies in the Seto Inland Sea, a narrow strait of grey-green water that divides Honshu from the smaller islands that dot the region like scattered stones. On this island, rising from the shore with austere geometry, stood the Imperial Japanese Naval Academy, a fortress of discipline and ambition where young men arrived each spring to be remade into officers of the empire. When Mineichi Koga passed through its gates in the early years of the 20th century, perhaps around 1903 or 1904, he was joining an institution already steeped in nearly 3 decades of careful refinement, a place where tradition and modernization existed in a state of deliberate tension. Etajima was not a school in the gentle sense of the word. It was a crucible. The cadets who entered wore uniforms that seemed designed to compress the chest and straighten the spine, and their days began before dawn with the ringing of bells that echoed across the compound without mercy or variation. The buildings themselves were stern affairs, dormitories arranged in long rows, classrooms with high windows that admitted light but discouraged distraction, parade grounds where young men stood in formation under skies that could be blindingly bright or grey with approaching weather. Everything about the place whispered the same message: You are no longer who you were before you arrived. The routine at Etajima was methodical to a degree that seems almost incomprehensible to modern understanding. A cadet's day was parceled into segments, each precisely allocated time for study, drilling, physical training, and a kind of supervised recreation that bore little resemblance to leisure. Rising at dawn meant standing in formation, while instructors examined uniforms for any deviation, a button not perfectly aligned, a collar slightly askew, shoes that had not achieved the requisite shine. These were not minor infractions, they were violations of order itself, and punishment could range from written reprimands to more severe physical disciplines that ranged from caning to forced exercises that left young men breathing heavily in the humid air of the compound. What drew Koga to this place, we might wonder? For a young man of his family background, descended from samurai stock, raised in a provincial prefecture where honor and service were not abstract concepts, but the very texture of daily life, the Naval Academy represented a particular kind of pathway. His father had likely encouraged it, or perhaps there was family connection to the Navy already established. In either case, entering Etajima meant accepting a clear identity. You were now a future officer of Japan's modern fleet, a guardian of maritime power in an era when naval strength increasingly determined a nation's standing in the world. The curriculum itself blended two distinct worldviews, though few cadets may have recognized this consciously as they labored through their studies. There was, on one hand, the classical military education inherited from samurai traditions, the study of strategy through historical texts, the cultivation of moral character through philosophy and reflection, the elevation of honor and loyalty above personal comfort or ambition. Koga would have encountered this through lectures on naval history, through the lives of celebrated commanders, through the constant reminder that he was part of a lineage reaching back through centuries of warfare and service. But running alongside this traditional stream was something newer, more relentlessly technical. Koga and his fellow cadets studied mathematics with rigor, gunnery calculations, navigation by the stars and by instruments, the architecture of steel ships, and the emerging science of naval engineering. They learned about coal-burning engines and the transition to oil-fired propulsion. They studied the tactics not only of Japanese naval history, but of contemporary naval powers, the British Royal Navy, which still dominated the world's oceans, and the American Navy, which was growing in capability with each passing year. They absorbed, in other words, the knowledge necessary to command the most sophisticated instruments of war that humanity had yet invented. How did a young man like Koga navigate this duality? It seems likely that he was exactly the sort to take both aspects seriously, to see no contradiction between meditating on the virtues of the samurai and mastering the calculus required to aim a modern battleship's guns. The discipline of the academy would have appealed to something in his temperament, perhaps the same quality that made him prefer steady competence to brilliant improvisation, that drew him toward careful planning rather than dramatic gambles. The social hierarchy within the academy was rigid and carefully observed. New cadets, the youngest students, occupied a subordinate position that verged on ritualized humiliation. Older cadets exercised authority over them with the full sanction of the institution, and this system of hierarchy within hierarchy was justified as a necessary means of building character, of teaching obedience before responsibility, of weeding out those who could not endure pressure. Koga would have experienced this, the harsh correction from seniors, the endless tasks assigned to prove worthiness, the constant evaluation of performance against an invisible standard of perfection. Yet he seems to have accepted it without apparent bitterness, or at least without complaint that survived into the historical record. Perhaps this was simply what he expected. Perhaps his family background had already prepared him for such an environment. The years at Etajima stretched forward with glacial regularity. Seasons changed outside the walls, but the routine remained constant. The autumn typhoons brought violent rain that tested the drains and gutters of the compound. The summers brought a dense heat that seemed to emanate from the stone itself and could turn the parade ground into a shimmering expanse of discomfort. Yet still the bells rang, and still the cadets formed their ranks, and still the instructors demanded perfection in every gesture and posture. What did these years do to Koga's mind and character? We can only infer from the shape of his later life. They seem to have instilled in him a particular approach to duty, methodical, thorough, resistant to shortcuts or displays. They likely deepened a natural tendency toward caution and careful observation. The academy was, in essence, a machine for producing a certain kind of officer, one who understood order not as something imposed from without, but as the fundamental basis of all effective action. Whether Koga entered with this disposition already formed, or whether Etajima shaped him into it, remains difficult to determine with precision. The education he received was also, we should recognize, consciously designed to prepare him for service in a fleet that was itself in the midst of profound transformation. When Koga was a cadet, the Japanese Navy was still comparing itself primarily to the Russian Navy and to the older British tradition. But the Spanish-American War of 1898 had demonstrated the emerging power of American naval might, and by the time Koga neared graduation, Japan's naval planners were already beginning to think in terms of potential conflict with the United States, a possibility that seemed distant and theoretical, but was nonetheless beginning to shape strategic thinking. The curriculum at Etajima was, in a subtle way, preparing cadets for a world in which their navy might need to contest for supremacy across the vast Pacific. What this would ultimately mean, neither Koga nor any of his instructors could have fully grasped. The cadet corps itself formed a kind of brotherhood, though perhaps brotherhood is too warm a word. It was rather a shared ordeal, a common descent through the same trials and disciplines that bound these young men together. They slept in the same dormitories, ate the same austere meals, endured the same corrections, celebrated the same modest victories when examinations were passed or drills executed without error. This created bonds of loyalty that would persist throughout their careers, networks of connection that would later prove important as these officers rose through the ranks. Koga, we might imagine, was not a man to form intense friendships, but he would have been embedded in this network of shared experience, would have understood its unspoken codes and obligations. By the time Koga approached graduation, likely around 1906 or 1907, depending on which year he entered, he had been transformed from a provincial youth into something quite deliberately constructed, an officer of the Imperial Japanese Navy. He would have known the regulations, the protocols, the vast body of technical knowledge necessary to function effectively at sea. He would have internalized the values of the institution, the emphasis on hierarchy, order, and duty above personal preference. He would have understood, at a level deeper than mere intellectual comprehension, what it meant to be part of something larger than himself. And yet, what did his instructors see when they gazed upon this carefully molded product? Did they recognize him as exceptional in any way? Did they mark him as someone destined for high command, or was he merely competent, steady, the kind of officer who would serve reliably in whatever role was assigned? The historical record offers little guidance here. Koga does not emerge from his academy years as a celebrated figure, does not appear in the reminiscences of famous instructors, or in the selective memories of his fellow cadets who later achieved prominence. This very absence of dramatic note may itself be telling. Perhaps it reflects the fundamental quality of his character, a disinclination toward self-promotion or the cultivation of notable incidents. Or perhaps it simply means that among the hundreds of cadets who passed through Etajima over the years, he was remembered, if at all, as merely one among many, competent but undistinguished. The Naval Academy's gates, once passed, opened onto a different ocean entirely. Young Koga stepped from the ceremonial precision of Etajima into something far more laborious and profound, the actual machinery of a growing fleet. His first posting came in 1907, aboard the cruiser Kasuga, a vessel that had already seen action in the Russo-Japanese War, and carried within its steel bones the accumulated experience of Japan's naval awakening. Here began the true apprenticeship, the years when a young officer learned not from textbooks but from the patient repetition of seamanship, the endless drills, the slow internalization of what it meant to serve aboard a warship in the Emperor's name. The Kasuga was no flagship, no celebrated battleship destined for history. She was a working vessel, a cruiser of modest tonnage, and in this ordinariness lay her purpose. Koga moved through her compartments as junior officers had moved through such spaces for centuries, learning the geography of pipes and valves, the rhythm of watches, the unspoken hierarchies that governed who spoke to whom and when. He learned gunnery on her decks, standing before the massive guns that would define naval warfare for another generation, learning not only their mechanical operation, but the mathematics that governed their firing, the calculations of distance, wind, the curvature of the earth itself. These were not abstract lessons. They were the difference between a ship sinking and remaining afloat, between men living and men dying in the cold and darkness of the sea. The pace of such learning cannot be hurried. Each gun practice was a meditation in precision. The crews would go through the motions again and again, the officers calling out bearing and elevation, the loaders and trainers moving with practiced efficiency. Koga stood among them, watching, correcting, absorbing into his memory the exact moment when a gun captain's eye would betray an error, the subtle pause that indicated hesitation. He learned navigation alongside gunnery, how to read the stars, how to plot a course by dead reckoning, how to interpret the sea and sky as texts written in wind and light. These skills would serve him for 50 years, long after the guns themselves had become obsolete, because they cultivated in him a particular kind of mind, one that could hold complexity, that could calculate without instruments when instruments failed, that could make decisions with the weight of dozens of lives behind them. The Japanese Navy of those years was itself young, still learning how to be a modern force. The officers who surrounded Koga, his superiors, his peers, the older captains who had fought the Russians, they were constructing a navy almost as they served in it. There was a certain fervor to this, a sense that the fleet was not merely following tradition but creating it. The command culture that took shape around Koga was peculiar, a blend of samurai honor codes adapted to industrial warfare, of Confucian hierarchy applied to the crew quarters of modern warships. An officer was expected to embody not merely competence but a kind of moral authority, a presence that inspired obedience through something deeper than rank alone. Between 1907 and the early 1920s, Koga moved through a succession of cruisers and larger vessels, each posting adding a layer to his accumulated knowledge. He served on the armored cruiser Iwate, a ship that had itself fought against the Russians. He later took positions aboard destroyers, those smaller, more agile vessels that demanded of their officers a different kind of decisiveness. There is something in the nature of a destroyer captain's role that changes a man. The ship responds to command more directly, the margin for error is smaller, the relationship between an officer's intention and the vessel's action is immediate and visceral. Koga moved through these various platforms as a student moves through different rooms of a vast library, each one teaching him something distinct about the nature of command, the relationship between machinery and human will, the strange alchemy by which a few hundred men in steel could be transformed into an instrument of power. The gunnery specialization that Koga developed became his distinguishing mark. In the Imperial Japanese Navy of the early 20th century, gunnery officers held a particular prestige. They were the experts in what many still considered the essential naval art, the long-range gun battle, the decisive engagement where capital ships would hurl shells at one another across horizons they could barely see. Koga's meticulous temperament was well suited to this discipline. Gunnery demanded exactitude, the accumulation of data, the patient refinement of technique. It required a mind that could think in ballistics and trajectories, that could imagine invisible paths through empty air and understand them as clearly as if they were drawn on a chart. What emerges from this long apprenticeship is a portrait not of brilliance, not of flamboyance, but of something perhaps more valuable in a professional officer, a kind of methodical competence that grew more pronounced with each passing year. Koga was not the sort of man who would draw attention at a social gathering, who would dazzle subordinates with rhetorical flourish, or inspire them through charisma alone. Instead, he accumulated competence, the way a reef accumulates coral, layer upon layer, each experience adding to the whole until something substantial had taken shape. His peers noticed this, noted in their reports that here was a reliable man, thorough, careful, not given to recklessness. The sea itself seemed to teach him its central lesson, that complexity requires patience, that power properly exercised is often quiet power, that the appearance of effortlessness comes only through disciplined, unglamorous practice. The ships themselves, as Koga moved among them, were being transformed even as he learned their secrets. New technologies arrived in the fleet, improved fire control systems, wireless telegraphy that could transmit orders across miles of ocean, new metallurgies that allowed for stronger hulls and faster speeds. Each innovation required retraining, demanded that officers unlearn old habits and adopt new practices. This constant state of technical evolution must have been both exhilarating and exhausting, a reminder that mastery is always provisional, always subject to disruption by the next technological shift. Yet Koga seems to have taken this in stride, absorbing each new development, making it part of his expanding knowledge, never clinging so rigidly to old methods that new ones could not be adopted. The command culture aboard these vessels was beginning to show signs of the rigidity and factional tension that would later characterize the Imperial Japanese Navy in its final years. Even in these early decades, there were philosophical divisions about the proper direction for the fleet to take. Some officers, particularly those involved in gunnery and big gun tactics, believed that naval warfare would always ultimately be decided by battleship engagements, by the kind of massive gun battles that characterized 19th century naval tradition. Others, even at this early date, could perceive that naval aviation was rising, that aircraft might someday challenge the supremacy of the battleship. These divisions were nascent, not yet the bitter factional warfare they would become, but they were present nonetheless, shaping conversations in officers' clubs and wardrooms, influencing how young men like Koga were mentored, and toward what understanding of naval doctrine they were guided. Through all of this, the endless drills, the study of gunnery tables, the navigation through uncharted waters, both literal and professional, Koga developed what might be called a naval officer's wisdom. It was not the wisdom of philosophers or scholars, but something more practical and incarnate, an understanding written into the body through repetition, sunk into the bones through years of experience aboard working vessels. He learned that ships are lived in as much as commanded, that the relationship between an officer and his crew is built through 1,000 small interactions rather than through grand pronouncements. He learned that the sea is indifferent to human intention, that all the planning and precision in the world cannot account for its moods, and that a captain's first duty is to understand and respect this irreducible wildness. By the early 1920s, when Koga had served nearly 15 years in this patient accumulation of experience, he had become something recognizable and valued in any professional military organization, a thoroughly competent officer with no particular brilliance but a steady reliability that could be depended upon. He had not become famous. He was not celebrated in newspapers or known among the general public, but among those who mattered in the Imperial Japanese Navy, the senior commanders, the fleet staff, the captains of great ships, his name was noted. Here was a man, the assessments seemed to suggest, who knew his business. Here was an officer who could be trusted with significant responsibility, who would not gamble with his men's lives out of ego or ambition, who understood that the sea itself was the greatest adversary any captain would ever face, and that a ship well maintained and well commanded was armor enough against all enemies save luck and circumstance. The world Koga entered as a young officer was itself in the grip of a fundamental disagreement about what naval warfare actually was. Japan's navy, like navies everywhere in those decades, faced a choice that seemed almost philosophical in its depths. Would the great warship, the battleship, remain the supreme instrument of naval power, bristling with massive guns that could hurl shells across horizons the human eye could scarcely reach? Or would the future belong to a different kind of dominance entirely, one that came from the air, from aircraft launched from carriers that themselves might never come within sight of an enemy. This was not a small matter of tactical preference, you understand. It touched on everything, on how ships were designed and built, on which officers rose in prestige and influence, on the very soul of what it meant to be a warrior at sea. The battleship had defined naval combat since the dreadnought age began in the early 1900s. There was something almost sacred about it in the minds of the officer corps. A battleship was visible, immense, bristling with the machinery of human will made metal. You could stand on its deck and feel the weight of tradition beneath your feet. It was the natural throne from which a fleet commander would view battle, the concentration of national treasure and industrial might in a single hull. And yet, even as these ships grew larger and more fearsome, with guns of ever greater caliber, something quieter was happening in hangars and on wooden flight decks. Aircraft were becoming faster, more reliable, capable of carrying larger weapons over greater distances. The question that kept naval theorists awake in their studies was not whether this was possible, it clearly was, but whether it could be decisive. Could you sink an enemy fleet without ever seeing it? Could victory come from an invisible hand, reaching out from clouds you could not see into? The Imperial Japanese Navy wrestled with this tension as acutely as any maritime power. Japan had invested staggering resources in battleships. The pride of the fleet, ships like the Yamato and Musashi, were the largest battleships ever constructed. They represented not merely military capability, but also something deeper, the concentrated will of a nation to be powerful, to be respected, to command the Pacific. These vessels carried guns so enormous that a single salvo was an event, a moment of almost incomprehensible force. To suggest that such ships might be rendered obsolete by small, fragile aircraft crewed by young men flying wooden and fabric contraptions seemed almost like heresy to the admirals who had devoted their entire professional lives to battleship doctrine. And yet there were those in the fleet who saw more clearly into the future, men who had observed foreign navies, who studied the mathematics of distance and firepower, who recognized that the nature of naval warfare was shifting in front of their eyes, even if the recognition brought them no comfort. The British had already demonstrated something troubling at the Mediterranean port of Taranto, back in 1940, when carrier-borne aircraft had attacked a battleship fleet at anchor and inflicted serious damage. But there was always a way to rationalize such incidents. The ships had been stationary. The pilots had achieved surprise. Surely in fleet-to-fleet combat, where both sides were alert and maneuvering, the old rules would reassert themselves. The battleship would resume its throne. This debate, unresolved and deeply felt, shaped the character of the Japanese fleet as Koga moved through its ranks. The battleship faction remained powerful, particularly among the most senior officers and in the fleet's administrative structure. These were men who had spent decades in the tradition of big gun combat, men who had read the theorists of the previous generation, men for whom a battleship fleet in line of battle represented the apex of human military organization. But alongside them, and increasingly vocal, were officers of the aviation arm, the younger, more restless voices, who saw in the carrier and the torpedo plane a liberation from the constraints of ship-to-ship combat, a new kind of power that was not bound by the visible horizon. Japan attempted, in its peculiar way, to honor both philosophies at once. The Japanese Navy would build fast battleships and also aircraft carriers. It would train both gunnery officers and aviators to the highest standard. It would prepare for fleet battles conducted in the old manner, while also quietly stockpiling the weapons and tactics of the new. This was not exactly a strategy, though it was sometimes dressed up as one. It was more like a cultural compromise, a way of saying to both the traditionalists and the modernists, you may both be right. The cost of maintaining this tension was never fully reckoned. Resources that might have gone into a single, coherent doctrine were split between two competing visions. Officers selected for advancement might be chosen because they represented one faction or another, sometimes because they seemed neutral enough to alienate neither side. The fleet developed what you might call a philosophical squint, a way of looking at naval warfare that insisted on seeing it both ways at once. This was not unique to Japan, but perhaps the Japanese felt it more acutely because they were entering a war in which clarity of doctrine and unity of purpose would be matters of survival. Koga, moving through this environment in the 1920s and into the 1930s, would have encountered both traditions. He would have served under officers who were committed battleship men, for whom the future belonged to the great guns and the line of battle. He would also have served alongside the aviation pioneers, the men who were quietly building the carrier arm into something formidable. A careful observer, and Koga was always careful, might have noticed that the ground beneath the fleet's feet was shifting, even as the surface remained orderly and traditional. The Japanese Navy of this era was, in many ways, a fleet in conversation with itself about its own future, and that conversation, conducted quietly in officers' studies and in the planning rooms of the Naval Ministry, would shape every decision made when war finally came. It would influence how ships were positioned, how battles were imagined, what hopes and fears occupied the minds of commanders who had to decide, in moments of terrible clarity, whether to trust the battleship or the aircraft carrier with their nation's fate. The turning point in Koga's young career came not through dramatic command or battlefield accomplishment, but through something far quieter, an assignment that would eventually shape the very quality of mind that might have defined his leadership. In the early years of the 20th century, when the Imperial Japanese Navy was still learning to walk among the great maritime powers of Europe and America, senior officers were sometimes selected for staff work, for diplomatic observation, for the slow, patient study of foreign navies. And it was in these roles, away from the fleet, away from the noise and certainty of shipboard routine, that Mineichi Koga began to develop the cautious, deeply methodical temperament that would mark him as fundamentally different from many of his more mercurial peers. During the 1920s and into the early 1930s, Koga found himself assigned to positions that required him to observe, to analyze, to sit in rooms with naval attachés and foreign officers and listen more than he spoke. He spent time observing the British Royal Navy, whose institutional mastery and technical precision were still, in those years, the standard by which all other navies measured themselves. What did he see in the corridors of British naval tradition? A navy that had learned, over centuries, to maintain its dominance through careful planning, through the integration of new technologies into existing doctrines, through a kind of patient institutional wisdom. The British did not rush, they did not leap to conclusions. They built upon foundations already proven. Koga, quietly absorbing these lessons, carried them with him like ballast in his thinking. He also observed the United States Navy, which in those interwar years was modernizing with remarkable speed and confidence, its officers speaking of aircraft and oil-burning battleships, and the vast industrial capacity that would underpin any prolonged naval conflict. There was something in the American approach, a kind of deliberate, almost machine-like efficiency, that impressed upon Koga a certain respect, and perhaps, if one reads the historical record carefully, a quiet concern. Can we match them? Not just in ships, but in the deeper things, in factories, in resources, in time. These were the questions that might have formed themselves in his mind during those years abroad, questions he likely kept to himself. What distinguished Koga from some of his more aggressive contemporaries was precisely this habit of observation without immediate judgment, of gathering facts and turning them slowly in his mind before drawing conclusions. Where other officers might see the rising tide of Japanese military ambition and feel called to ride it forward with enthusiasm, Koga seemed to operate from a different register entirely. He was the man who asked questions. He was the man who wanted to understand not just what his own navy could do, but what others could do, and more importantly, what they might do in response. This was not, perhaps, the temperament of a warrior eager for glory. It was the temperament of a man trying to see the whole board. These assignments in observation and diplomatic circles also exposed Koga to a world that many purely military officers never encountered, the world of negotiation, of treaty language, of the delicate balance between national ambition and international law. Japan in this era was navigating a strange and increasingly fraught position. The Washington Naval Treaty of 1922 had placed strict limits on battleship tonnage, attempting to prevent an arms race among the world's great powers. Officers like Koga, assigned to understand the implications of these treaties, to calculate how they constrained Japanese naval development, had to think in terms of international law and diplomacy, not merely military doctrine. This too seems to have shaped him, instilling in him a recognition that war was not purely a military question, that the political and diplomatic dimensions were equally real, equally constraining. His work in these years was not glamorous. There were no triumphant battleship engagements, no daring cruiser raids, no stories that would make for stirring accounts in military histories. Instead, there was the patient work of studying intelligence reports, of attending naval conferences, of learning to read between the lines of what foreign officers said about their own nation's strengths and weaknesses. If you imagine Koga in these years, a tall, lean man with steady eyes, speaking softly even in his native language, taking careful notes, observing more than participating in conversations, you begin to see the contours of the officer he would become. One might wonder whether this cautious, analytical approach to naval strategy made him an ideal officer for a peacetime navy, but a potential liability for one engaged in total war, perhaps. Or perhaps it made him something else, a man capable of seeing problems clearly, even when seeing them clearly was painful, even when the official current of opinion pushed toward other conclusions. The years he spent abroad, watching Western navies, studying their strengths and resources, seemed to have crystallized in him a certain realistic assessment of Japan's position in the world. He understood, it seems, in ways that his more optimistic peers did not fully embrace, that if Japan went to war with the Western powers, it would be fighting not merely their navies but their economies, their industries, their vast reserves of trained manpower and material resources. This understanding did not make him a voice crying out against the gathering clouds of war. He was far too much a man of his institution, too embedded in the structures of the Imperial Navy, to play that role. But it gave him a certain gravity, a certain reserve in his judgments, a tendency to prepare for the worst while hoping for the best. It was the temperament of a man who had seen too much, learned too much about the capabilities of other navies, to be swept up in simple confidence about Japan's inevitable victory. The years that followed Koga's return from overseas observation were marked not by dramatic declaration or public acclaim, but by a quieter kind of ascension through the naval ranks. The 1920s opened before him as a decade of steady advancement, each posting a careful step along a well-worn path that led from junior command to positions of increasing responsibility within the fleet's administrative machinery. This was a period when the Imperial Japanese Navy, still flush with the perceived victories of the Great War, was engaged in a subtle and often invisible competition, not primarily with foreign navies, though that concern never truly faded, but with itself, with its own competing visions of what the future of naval warfare would demand. Koga's assignments during these years placed him in the kind of roles that, while essential to the functioning of a vast military organization, attracted neither the public's imagination nor the chronicler's keen attention. He served in various staff positions within the Navy Ministry, occupied himself with matters of logistics and supply, undertook shore commands where his steady competence could be applied to the patient work of training younger officers and maintaining the fleet's fighting readiness. There was something almost austere about the trajectory of his career when set against the glittering trajectories of some of his more celebrated contemporaries. Where others seemed to move through their commissions wreathed in a kind of purposeful glamour, marked by decisive gestures and memorable pronouncements, Koga accumulated his authority more gradually, through the accumulation of sound judgment and the quiet respect of those who worked beneath and alongside him. Consider, by contrast, the path of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto during this same period. Yamamoto, that brilliant and often restless mind, had already begun to make waves through the naval hierarchy, with his unconventional thinking about air power, his early recognition that the battleship might not remain the supreme instrument of naval war. Yamamoto's career was marked by a kind of intellectual magnetism, by the force of his personality and the boldness of his strategic vision. He moved through the 1920s and into the 1930s as a figure of consequence and controversy, someone whose opinions mattered, whose presence in a room seemed to shift the temperature of naval discourse. By contrast, Koga advanced through these same years with a kind of methodical consistency that, while never questioned, rarely generated the same kind of passionate adherence or fierce debate. There was Admiral Osamu Nagano as well, who would eventually rise to become Chief of the Naval General Staff, a figure of considerable authority and influence, whose star seemed to burn with particular brightness during the early 1930s. And there were others, younger men like Chuichi Nagumo, who were beginning to make names for themselves through their command of aircraft carrier squadrons and their demonstrated mastery of the new methods of naval aviation. These officers seemed to embody the future of the Navy in a way that commanded attention and sparked imagination. Their names appeared in reports and memoranda with a frequency and prominence that suggested they were the architects of whatever was to come. Koga, by this time, had accepted something that perhaps suited his temperament. He was a competent administrator and an experienced sea officer, but he was not going to be the man who revolutionized naval thinking or challenged the established orthodoxies of fleet doctrine. This was not a failure on his part, but rather a kind of honest recognition of where his strengths lay and what contribution he was best suited to make. Those strengths were real and not inconsiderable. He understood logistics in the way that only a man who has grappled with the practical challenges of keeping a fleet supplied and functional can understand them. He possessed the kind of temperament that allowed him to work effectively within bureaucratic structures without becoming corrupted by them. He could make difficult decisions without the paralysis that sometimes grips those who are too acutely aware of all the possible consequences of their choices. During the early 1930s, Koga held command of the cruiser Kashi and later took on increasingly senior staff positions within the fleet hierarchy. These were the years when Japan was beginning to move more openly toward a policy of aggressive expansion on the Asian mainland, when the seizure of Manchuria in 1931 had already marked a turning point in Japanese imperial ambitions. The Navy during this period was engaged in intense internal debates about its own future role and strategy. There were those who believed primarily in battleship doctrine, who clung to the traditional view that naval supremacy meant battleship supremacy. And there were those who, like Yamamoto, were beginning to argue with increasing force that aircraft carriers represented the future, that the great guns of the battleship would soon be rendered obsolete by the long-reaching arms of naval aviation. Koga found himself working, through these years, in positions that required him to grapple with the practical implications of these debates. It was one thing to theorize about the future of naval warfare in the comfortable halls of the Naval War College or in the salons of Tokyo, where senior officers gathered to discuss strategy. It was quite another to actually attempt to integrate these competing doctrines into a coherent fleet structure, to allocate resources and personnel in ways that acknowledged both the traditional and the emerging technologies. This was Koga's domain, and he moved through it with a kind of steady expertise that, while never flashy, proved increasingly indispensable. By the mid-1930s, Koga had assumed command of significant naval installations and fleet units. His promotions came steadily, marked by the passing of each examination and each successful command rotation. He rose to the rank of Rear Admiral in 1934, a promotion that reflected his accumulated experience and demonstrated competence. This was a rank that placed him among the senior officer corps, though not yet among the very highest echelons where the most consequential decisions about naval strategy were made. He was, in a sense, reaching the level at which he would become a maker of policy and strategy in his own right, rather than merely an executor of policies made by others. What distinguished Koga during this period from some of his more celebrated colleagues was a certain reserve, a reluctance to embrace the increasingly heated factional disputes that were beginning to tear at the fabric of the officer corps. The Imperial Japanese Navy of the 1930s was riven by deep divisions between what were known as the Fleet faction and the Treaty faction. These were not merely disagreements about strategy. They represented fundamental conflicts about Japan's future, about how the nation should relate to the Western powers, about whether Japan should accept the constraints of international naval treaties or pursue a course of unlimited rearmament. These disputes were not conducted in the civil, collegial manner of academic debate. They were often bitter, personal, and sometimes they erupted into violence, as younger officers, who felt betrayed by the accommodationist positions of their superiors, took matters into their own hands through assassination and attempted coup d'état. Koga, through all of this turmoil, maintained a kind of dignified distance. He was not indifferent to these disputes, nor was he unaware of their importance, but he seemed to approach them with a skepticism that had perhaps been reinforced by his years of observation of Western navies, by his understanding of the immense material advantages that would come into play should Japan find itself in conflict with nations like Britain or the United States. He was not a dove, exactly, but neither was he an unthinking advocate of aggressive expansion and unlimited rearmament. He represented something perhaps more complicated, a professional naval officer who understood the realities of sea power but was troubled by the trajectory that Japanese policy seemed to be following. It was during this period, as the 1930s deepened and drew toward their end, that Koga's reputation as a steady and reliable officer became increasingly fixed in the minds of the senior members of the naval hierarchy. Men in positions of supreme authority began to regard him as someone upon whom they could depend, someone who would carry out orders faithfully and think carefully about the implications of what he was being asked to do. This was not the kind of reputation that made a man famous, or that led to his name appearing prominently in the newspapers or in the gossip of naval circles. But it was a reputation that, when crisis came, would prove to have real value, and crisis, as the decade moved toward its close, was approaching Japan's navy with the inexorability of a storm front moving across the Pacific. To understand Mineichi Koga, it becomes necessary to step back from the particulars of his career and consider instead the world he inhabited, that intricate, often unspoken culture of the Imperial Japanese Navy, where honor, duty, and factional allegiance shaped every decision, every glance across a wardroom table, every quiet word spoken in the darkness of a smoky officers' club. The Japanese naval officer of Koga's era did not inhabit merely a professional institution. He belonged to something closer to a monastic order, a brotherhood bound by elaborate codes of conduct that traced their roots backward through centuries of samurai tradition. These men had been shaped since boyhood by a philosophy that placed collective honor above individual preservation, that taught the acceptance of death as a natural consequence of unwavering loyalty. When a young cadet stood in the classrooms of Etajima Naval Academy, he was not simply learning the mechanics of gunnery or navigation. He was being initiated into a system of thought that demanded absolute obedience to hierarchy, that framed self-sacrifice as the highest moral good, and that measured a man's worth not by his accumulation of wealth or power, but by the steadiness with which he could face duty, no matter how terrible its demands. Within this larger culture existed something more fractious, more human, the rivalry between factions that would come to define Japanese naval strategy and leadership through the 1920s and 1930s. These were not merely disagreements about tactics or budget allocations. They were ideological schisms that pitted different visions of Japan's naval future against one another, and they operated with a quiet ferocity that outsiders often failed to detect. On one side stood what became known as the Fleet faction, the Kantaiha. These officers, often younger and more aggressive in temperament, believed that naval power should be concentrated in large battleships, in capital ships that would dominate in a decisive fleet engagement. They saw the Navy as an instrument of imperial expansion, a weapon to be wielded boldly in pursuit of Japan's continental ambitions. The The fleet faction officers tended toward nationalism that verged on zealotry. They viewed compromise with the West as cowardice. They saw accommodation as a slow surrender of everything that made Japan worthy of respect among nations. Many of them harbored what might be called contempt for civilian government, for politicians who they believed failed to grasp the sacred duty that the military had been entrusted with. Arrayed against them was the so-called treaty faction, the Joyakuha. These officers, typically older and more cautious in their approach, argued for a navy bound by the limits imposed by international treaty. They believed in building balanced fleets, in accepting the constraints that diplomacy had established, in working within the framework of international law, even as that law disadvantaged Japan. To the treaty faction, prudence was not weakness, restraint was not surrender. There was honor in accepting temporary limitations, if doing so prevented premature war, preserved resources, allowed for careful preparation rather than reckless haste. The tensions between these two factions ran deeper than simple professional disagreement. There was genuine anger. There were moments when officers who held opposing views would barely acknowledge one another at official functions. There were instances of younger fleet faction officers making veiled or not so veiled insults about the patriotism of their treaty faction superiors. And there was, woven throughout these exchanges, an undercurrent of something darker, the possibility, the lurking threat of violence. One must understand that this was an era, particularly in Japan, when military factions had proven themselves willing to use assassination as a tool of political persuasion. The 1930s had witnessed the May 15th incident, and later the February 26th incident, instances in which junior military officers had murdered senior politicians and military leaders in the name of a purer vision of Japanese destiny. The memory of these events, shocking as they were to many, nevertheless established a pattern, a precedent, suggesting that if an officer felt sufficiently righteous in his cause, if he believed that his nation's very soul was at stake, then extrajudicial action might be not merely permissible, but obligatory. Koga navigated this minefield with what those who knew him noted as characteristic caution. He was not a natural factional warrior. His temperament did not incline him toward the passionate ideological declarations that marked the fleet faction's more vocal adherents. Neither, however, did he align himself so completely with the treaty faction as to invite the suspicion of the nationalist elements within the officer corps. Instead, he occupied a middle position, respected by both sides, fully committed to neither, a man whose loyalty seemed to be directed toward the institution itself, rather than toward any particular faction's vision of Japan's future. This quality, this refusal to become a partisan, would serve him well in the years to come, but it also meant that when he eventually found himself in positions of supreme authority, he would inherit not only the burdens of command, but also the unresolved tensions of these competing visions. He would have to contend with subordinates who harbored deep, fervent beliefs about how the Navy should operate, about what Japan's true destiny should be, and about the methods that were permissible in pursuing that destiny. The factional rivalries of the Imperial Japanese Navy, it should be noted, were not unique to Japan. Every military organization contains such tensions, between tradition and innovation, between caution and boldness, between those who see the institution as a tool of state policy and those who see it as something transcending civilian authority. What made the Japanese naval context distinctive was the intensity with which these disagreements were felt, the cultural weight that was placed upon them, and the historical moment at which they were occurring. Japan in the 1920s and 1930s was itself fractured. The civilian government was losing authority to military forces. The military itself was increasingly divided. There was a sense, growing year by year, month by month, that the nation was on a trajectory towards some unavoidable collision, either with the West or with itself, or perhaps with both. And within this larger uncertainty, officers like Koga were attempting to maintain professional competence, to navigate factional pressures, and to hold fast to codes of honor that seemed, with each passing season, increasingly difficult to reconcile with the political realities they were confronting. The honor codes themselves deserve a moment's reflection, for they shaped not merely how these men spoke to one another, but how they understood their very purpose in the world. A Japanese naval officer of this era was expected to embody certain virtues, loyalty above all, but also courage, integrity, a willingness to accept responsibility for failures, an understanding that rank carried not privilege but burden. There was an aesthetic dimension to this code as well, an expectation that a man would conduct himself with dignity, that he would face adversity without complaint, that he would find a kind of beauty in the acceptance of duty. And yet this code, beautiful as it was in its way, also contained within it certain tragic dimensions. It could be used to justify the unjustifiable. It could transform strategic disagreement into moral failing. An officer who questioned orders, who expressed doubt about a superior's judgment, who suggested that a particular course of action might be unwise. Such a man risked being seen not merely as professionally disagreeable, but as morally deficient, as lacking in true samurai spirit. The honor code, in other words, had a coercive element. It enforced conformity even as it seemed to celebrate virtue. Koga, by all accounts, lived according to these codes with genuine sincerity. He was not a man who merely performed honor, he appeared to believe in it deeply. And yet he also seemed to possess a quiet awareness that honor, taken to its logical extreme, could become destructive, both to himself and to the institution he served. This awareness never manifested itself in explicit challenge or denunciation. Rather, it seemed to express itself through his reserve, his reluctance to take strong public positions, his tendency to listen more than he spoke. What becomes clear, as one examines the naval culture of this era, is that men like Mineichi Koga were trapped within a system that demanded absolute loyalty while also containing irreconcilable contradictions. They were asked to be both flexible pragmatists and rigid idealists, both humble subordinates and wise leaders, both humble servants of the emperor and men capable of independent judgment. That such contradictions were never fully resolved did not diminish their force. If anything, it enhanced it, creating a kind of tension that became the defining emotional texture of the officer corps. The factionalism, the honor codes, the unspoken pressures, all of these created a world in which a man's character became, in some sense, his fate. And Koga's character, formed through decades of exposure to these pressures, had developed in certain recognizable directions. He was careful. He was observant. He was willing to accept limitation and constraint. And perhaps, one might wonder, in the quiet hours of examination, he had internalized the contradictions so thoroughly that he could no longer fully distinguish between what he believed and what he had been conditioned to believe. By the late 1930s, as the machinery of Japanese expansion continued its grinding acceleration across Manchuria and into China, Mineichi Koga occupied a position of considerable but unflashy influence within the Imperial Navy's highest councils. He had risen steadily, without the explosive visibility of some of his peers, to roles where his counsel on fleet matters was sought and, more importantly, listened to. And in those quiet rooms where admirals debated strategy and fate, Koga harbored thoughts that would have seemed almost heretical to the younger, more fervent officers who dreamed of empire and dominion across the Pacific. Unlike Yamamoto, who arrived at his famous conviction that Japan could win a swift victory but could not sustain a long war against America, through the lens of direct observation and mathematical certainty, Koga's doubts arose from a different soil. His skepticism was less the product of dramatic revelation and more the accumulation of a careful mind observing the trends of industrial capacity, the relentless expansion of American shipbuilding, the vast resource networks that fed the Western powers. Where Yamamoto was a brilliant strategist who could articulate his reservations with almost prophetic clarity, Koga was something quieter, a deeply cautious administrator who sensed the mathematics of an unwinnable contest without necessarily needing to proclaim it from the rooftops. The distinction matters, and it matters greatly for understanding what Koga would face when his time of greatest responsibility finally arrived. Yamamoto's doubts were dramatic, forceful, expressed in conversations and letters with an almost desperate urgency. Koga's reservations, by contrast, seemed to operate at a lower frequency, present in the way he approached logistics, the way he calculated the sustainability of naval operations, the way his various assignments and recommendations consistently pointed toward a philosophy of conservation and methodical preparation rather than rushing headlong into open conflict. Consider the trajectory of his assignments through the 1930s and the approach to war. He was involved in negotiations, in planning, in the complex inter-service politics that governed Japanese military strategy in those years before December 1941. These were not glamorous postings. They did not come with the public acclaim or the romantic aura of fleet command. But they were the sinews and bones of actual power, the places where policy was genuinely shaped, and Koga, by most accounts of those who served alongside him, deployed his influence with a kind of patient realism that stood in subtle but genuine contrast to the rising fever of militarism that gripped so many sectors of the officer corps. There is an often overlooked dimension to Japanese naval leadership in this era, the deep and sometimes bitter factional divisions that ran through the fleet like fault lines in stone. The so-called fleet faction, composed of younger officers and those who advocated for aggressive expansion and a confrontation with the Western powers, had been gaining ground for years. The treaty faction, by contrast, represented a more moderate voice, officers who believed that Japan's future lay in careful diplomacy, in working within the international system, in building steadily rather than gambling catastrophically. It would be too neat, too simple, to place Koga squarely into one camp or the other. His career and his temperament resisted such easy categorization, but his actions and his counsel, when examined closely, suggested a man who, while not openly defying the increasingly dominant militarism around him, was deeply uncomfortable with the path upon which the nation was being propelled. What did Koga fear, if we may ask that question gently? The evidence suggests he feared, above all, the exhaustion of resources. A naval officer of his generation had been raised to understand the fundamental vulnerability of the Japanese archipelago, an island nation utterly dependent on imported oil, imported iron, imported rubber, imported tin. Every ton of American steel, every barrel of American oil that Japan lacked, was a weight upon the scales. He had studied Western navies, not merely to understand their tactics, but to comprehend their industrial base, the seemingly inexhaustible wells of production that American factories could draw upon. And he had come to understand, with a sobriety that not all of his contemporaries shared, that if Japan were to wage a long war against such an opponent, the outcome was never truly in doubt. Yet here he was, a senior officer in a nation hurtling toward precisely that conflict. What was he to do? Resign on principle? Such a course would have been almost unthinkable and would have served no practical purpose. He would simply have been replaced by someone more pliable, more enthusiastic. Speak out loudly and persistently in opposition to the war. This too would have resulted in his isolation, or worse, and would have left the moderate voices in the military establishment bereft of his steady counsel. So Koga, like many thoughtful people caught in the undertow of historical forces they cannot fully arrest, seems to have chosen a different path, to remain in position, to offer such counsel as he could to those who would listen, to prepare for the conflict he believed inevitable, while harboring the quiet hope that somehow, through some means not yet visible, the nation might yet pull back from the brink. It is important to note that this was not cowardice, nor was it passive acceptance. It was, perhaps, a species of tragic realism, the recognition that one man, however senior, however level-headed, could not reverse tides that had begun their surge long before his rise to prominence. And so he worked within the constraints of his role, exercising what influence he could, and preparing, in his methodical and careful way, for a future he dreaded but could not prevent. By early 1941, as the final decisions were being made in Tokyo, as the military and civilian leadership converged upon the fateful decision to strike at Pearl Harbor, Koga stood at a crossroads. He was now a full admiral, respected, experienced, capable. He was no longer a young man questioning the direction of policy from a subordinate position. He was, whether he fully embraced it or not, a man whose authority and influence would shape what came next. The question that hung unspoken in the corridors of naval headquarters was this: what would Koga do when the war came, as it seemed now certain to do? How would his temperament, his cautious philosophy, his deep reservations about the feasibility of victory translate into action once the fleet was actually fighting for its life? These were not merely theoretical concerns. They would determine in many ways how the Pacific War itself would unfold. The moment came quietly at first, in the pre-dawn hours of December 7, 1941, when the first wave of Japanese aircraft lifted from the carrier decks north of Pearl Harbor. In Tokyo, in the ministries and the war rooms where the great decisions had been made in secret, there was a strange suspension, a held breath, as if the entire nation itself had paused on the threshold between the world that was and the world that would follow. And somewhere in those institutional corridors, in offices and conference halls where strategy was mapped across charts and tables marked with pencils and pins, Admiral Mineichi Koga stood witness to the opening of what Japanese planners had assured themselves would be a swift and overwhelming victory. But Koga himself was not at sea. This is perhaps one of the quiet ironies that would eventually push him toward obscurity, that when the Pacific War erupted into being, he held a position of senior authority on shore, removed from the immediate thunder of guns and the spread of blood across decks. He was, at this moment, commanding the China Area Fleet, a vast administrative apparatus stretched across occupied Chinese waters and the coastlines that Japan had already claimed through years of grinding campaign and political pressure. It was not the position of the great sea battles. It was not where Yamamoto was, coordinating the strikes across the Pacific from his flagship, yet it was, in its own way, as essential and as grinding as anything that happened in those first hours of open war. The early victories came with an almost dreamlike speed that autumn and winter. The American battleships at Pearl Harbor sat burning in the harbor, while Japanese fleets pressed outward in every direction, south toward Malaya and Singapore, east toward the Philippines, west toward Burma and the Indian Ocean. The British battleship Prince of Wales was sunk by Japanese torpedo bombers off Malaya. American airfields in the Philippines erupted in flame as Japanese bombers appeared overhead. The great fortress of Singapore, thought to be impregnable, fell within weeks. Each victory seemed to confirm what the architects of Japanese strategy had promised, that the Americans and British, unprepared and demoralized, would quickly sue for peace, leaving Japan in mastery of an enormous swathe of the Pacific and Asian world. The Japanese press spoke of the Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere as though it were already an accomplished fact rather than a vision bought with lives and treasure. The naval strategy underpinning these early triumphs was, in its bones, an elegant thing. Japanese planners had understood for years that they could never build a fleet large enough to match the industrial might of the United States in a prolonged war. Instead, they had conceived a different vision. By striking first, by capturing vast territories rich in oil, rubber, tin, and other strategic materials, Japan could entrench itself in a defensive perimeter across the Pacific. American territory was vast, and their industrial capacity seemingly unlimited, yes, but they were far away. Any American attempt to retake lost ground would have to cross thousands of miles of ocean. Japanese forces, fighting from bases they controlled, could harry and weaken the American fleet through attrition, until, the theory went, American resolve fractured under the burden of distant, endless war. It was a strategy born of necessity and bounded by the hard mathematics of industrial inequality. Whether it was achievable or merely a beautiful illusion remained, in those first weeks, an open question that nobody dared ask aloud. Koga, commanding the China Area Fleet, was perhaps uniquely positioned to understand the fragility beneath these triumphs. The waters he patrolled and controlled were not empty theatre, they were contested space, spaces where the machinery of occupation ground against the realities of resistance and supply. His fleet had to protect convoys carrying resources back to the home islands. It had to maintain security along China's coast and rivers against Chinese nationalist and communist forces who remained unconquered despite years of effort. It had to coordinate with army units ashore, an operation that required constant negotiation, patience, and a peculiar form of strategic thinking that was neither purely naval nor purely terrestrial, but something in between. The victories rolling in from other theatres, from Yamamoto's strike forces, from the army advances in Southeast Asia, created a peculiar pressure. Everyone was winning. The momentum seemed unstoppable. Yet in the China Area Fleet Command, there would have been moments when Koga, a man trained by decades of careful observation, might have paused to consider certain uncomfortable facts. The American industrial capacity was untouched. American resolve, far from shattering, seemed to be hardening into something far more dangerous than fear. The capture of vast territories meant that Japan now had to garrison them, protect them, supply them. Obligations that grew heavier with each passing month rather than lighter. How does a commander maintain both optimism and realism in a moment like this? How does he perform the functions of an officer in a swiftly mobilizing nation while holding in his mind the knowledge that this grand strategy, however brilliant in conception, might be fatally flawed in execution? The early months of the war saw a strange bifurcation in the Japanese naval experience. The great striking forces under Yamamoto's command, the carriers and fast battleships, the modern destroyers and cruisers, ranged across the Pacific in operations that seemed to confirm the promise of swift victory. The Battle of the Coral Sea, the Battle of the Java Sea, the raids on Darwin, each was a triumph in its way, though some cost more than others. But for officers like Koga, immersed in the unglamorous work of maintaining the occupation, of protecting supply routes, of managing the administrative apparatus of a sprawling military domain, the war had a different character. It was patient and administrative. It was about the slow accumulation of tasks and problems that multiplied rather than diminished with success. The winter of 1941 to 1942 moved into spring, and the initial shock of the war's beginning began to settle into something more routine and systematic. Japan's early victories had indeed been extraordinary. They had seized an area of roughly 3 million square miles. They controlled resources that previously had been the domain of Western colonial powers. The dream of the co-prosperity sphere no longer seemed impossible. It seemed merely difficult, a matter of consolidation and protection rather than further conquest. Yet in those months when the news from the fighting fronts continued to be favorable, there would have been quiet hours when officers in shore commands could feel, if only in the smallest way, a current moving beneath the surface. A current that suggested the strategy was already beginning to strain under its own weight. The more territory Japan held, the more it had to defend. The more resources it captured, the more ships and men it needed to move and guard them. Every victory created new lines that had to be maintained, new garrisons that had to be supplied, new complications in an ever-lengthening supply network that stretched back to an industrial heartland that could not match the demands being placed upon it. Koga, in those early months of command, would have been orchestrating this enormous logistical dance with the methodical precision that characterized everything he did. And perhaps, in the quarters late at night, or in the intervals between briefings, he might have contemplated what Yamamoto himself was contemplating in his own headquarters, the question that underlay all the victories and the strategy they were meant to support. How long could this be sustained? And what would happen when the inevitable American counteroffensive came, when the initial shock wore off and American industry and American will began to press back against Japan's defensive perimeter? These were not questions that could be asked openly in 1942. The official story was victory, momentum, the inevitable triumph of Japanese courage and will over Western decadence and distance. but they were questions that lived in the calculations of officers like Koga, men whose training and experience had taught them to see beyond the headlines and the celebrations, to perceive the underlying mathematics of war. As the 1930s drew toward their close, and the full weight of Japan's continental ambitions became apparent, Koga found himself assigned to a role that would define the middle years of his career in ways both unglamorous and utterly essential. The China Area Fleet Command was not the sort of posting that captured headlines or inspired the romantic imaginings of a naval officer schooled in dreams of decisive fleet battles. Yet it was a command nonetheless, one that would teach him lessons about logistics, patience, and the grinding reality of maintaining control over vast stretches of occupied water that no amount of gunnery practice or naval theory could quite prepare a man for. The China Area Fleet was, in essence, a scattered dominion. Imagine waters stretching from the occupied coast of Manchukuo down through the Japanese-controlled reaches of the Chinese coast itself, through the ports of Shanghai, and further south into the waters around Canton and beyond. It was not a fleet designed for the decisive engagement that captured the imagination of battle-hungry officers. Rather, it was a fleet of smaller vessels, destroyers, fast cruisers, mine-layers, and an assortment of transports, tasked with the delicate, unglamorous work of keeping supply lines open, maintaining order across occupied harbors, and presenting a constant presence that discouraged any thought of organized resistance in the waters Japan had claimed. When one thinks of the Imperial Japanese Navy in this period, the mind conjures images of Yamamoto's great battleships, the gleaming capital ships that were the pride of the fleet. But Koga's world was different. It was one of constant small operations, of convoy escorts moving supplies to isolated garrisons, of patrols that discouraged submarine activity and kept pirates and Chinese nationalist naval forces at a careful distance. The logistical burden of such a command was almost impossible to overstate, and it is here that one begins to understand something essential about Koga's character. A lesser officer might have chafed at the assignment, might have seen it as a sidetrack from the path to greater glory. But Koga, methodical and thorough by temperament, approached it with the same careful attention he brought to everything. The waters under his jurisdiction were not simply strategic assets to be held, they were networks of interdependence. The coastal cities required constant replenishment. The garrison troops scattered across occupied territories needed ammunition, food, medical supplies, and the materials to maintain their positions. The naval bases themselves, and there were several, each with its own requirements, demanded an intricate choreography of supply, repair, and personnel rotation. Consider the simple matter of moving coal from the industrial heartland of Japan to the distant ports where it would fuel the furnaces of ships and the generators that powered the radio stations and searchlights of the defensive perimeter. This was not a task accomplished by grand strategy. It required detailed knowledge of which merchant vessels were reliable, which routes were safest, which harbors had adequate facilities for loading and unloading. It meant understanding the capacity of repair yards, the availability of skilled workers, the current state of Chinese resistance in any given region. It meant coordinating with the army, a branch of the Japanese military that did not always see eye to eye with naval planning, each service convinced of its own primacy and skeptical of the other's competence. Koga's temperament, one might suggest, was peculiarly suited to this work. He was not a flamboyant man given to dramatic gestures. He was not someone who sought to remake strategy through force of personality, as some of his contemporaries did. Rather, he was someone who understood that holding an empire required attention to detail, consistency, and a willingness to do the work that others found tedious. The China Area Fleet under his command became, by all accounts, a model of efficiency. Supply lines that had been disrupted by poor coordination were rationalized. The small ships under his command, rather than being allowed to fall into disrepair or complacency, were maintained at a high standard of readiness. When orders came down from Tokyo, they were executed with precision. Yet there was something else at work in these years, something that the historical record hints at without quite stating outright. Koga, positioned in these waters, was watching the war in China with careful eyes. He could see, as perhaps those ensconced in the security of Tokyo could not, just how difficult it was to truly occupy and hold a vast territory. The Japanese army had conquered enormous stretches of Chinese territory, yet the war continued, grinding on without resolution. Guerrilla activity remained constant. Supply lines were regularly harassed. The sheer scale of the commitment required to hold what had been conquered was staggering, and it only grew larger as Japan's strategic situation elsewhere began to shift. It was during these China area years that one might detect, if one were attentive to such subtle things, a certain quietness in Koga's demeanor that suggested something more than professional competence. He carried out his duties with the same meticulous care, but there was perhaps a faint suggestion of a man who was beginning to understand certain truths about warfare and empire that were not commonly spoken aloud in the circles of military power. The logistics of occupation revealed something that pure naval theory could not. It showed that holding territory was harder than taking it. It showed that even a great power, even one as formidable as the Japanese Empire in the 1930s and early 40s, had limits to what it could accomplish and sustain. The waters he commanded remained quiet, mostly. There were occasional incidents, skirmishes with Chinese forces, operations that required the mobilization of the smaller vessels under his command. These were not the grand battles that would be remembered in history, but they were, in their own way, the daily texture of maintaining control over conquered spaces. And through it all, Koga managed his fleet with the kind of competent steadiness that earned the respect of his officers without necessarily making him a figure of particular renown. It was the nature of his assignment that he remained somewhat apart from the great drama that was beginning to unfold across the Pacific. When Japan's leaders made the decision to strike at Pearl Harbor, when the great fleet engagements began to shape the course of the war, Koga continued his work in these familiar waters, managing the quotidian challenges of supply, coordination, and defense. He was, in a sense, tending to the rear areas, while the glamorous and terrible battles unfolded far away. Few would have predicted at that time that the methodical officer managing the China area fleet would one day find himself at the center of everything, inheriting a burden that would consume the last years of his life. Yet even in those first months of triumph, even as Japanese flags rose over conquered territories and the combined fleet seemed to command an entire ocean, something fundamental was beginning to shift, in ways that few could fully perceive. The victories came so swiftly, so comprehensively, that they carried within them the seeds of a different kind of understanding, one that would gradually reshape everything Koga and his contemporaries believed about their Navy's destiny. By the spring of 1942, as the cherry blossoms fell over Japanese cities and gardens, the Imperial Navy had already seized control of an empire stretching across millions of square miles of Pacific waters. The planners in Tokyo who had orchestrated this expansion had always understood that their advantage rested on a narrow window of time. Japan's resources were finite. American industrial capacity, though temporarily disrupted by the attack on Pearl Harbor, would eventually awaken like some vast, sleeping creature. The strategy, then, had been to consolidate power, to establish defensive perimeters, to create such a formidable network of island bases and fleet strength that any American counteroffensive would be prohibitively costly. In theory, the Americans would eventually sue for peace, exhausted by the prospect of reclaiming the Pacific island by island against a determined, well-positioned enemy. This was the calculus upon which everything rested. And then, in early June, near a small atoll called Midway, that calculus began to unravel. The Battle of Midway lasted only 3 days, yet within those 72 hours, the mathematical certainties that had guided Japanese naval planning underwent a profound reversal. 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, the Akagi, the Kaga, the Soryu, and the Hiryu, went to the bottom of the Pacific, taking with them not merely ships, but thousands of experienced pilots and aircrew whose knowledge and skill could never truly be replaced. The Americans lost 1 carrier, the Yorktown, in exchange. On the surface, The exchange rate might have seemed survivable, a cost of doing business in a long war. But the deeper wound ran along invisible lines of irreplaceability. Japanese pilot training programs, unlike those of the Americans, operated on a philosophy that the most skilled aviators should remain in combat until they were killed. There was a certain fierce logic to this approach. Maximize the effectiveness of your best people in the moment. Yet it meant that with each pilot lost, a repository of hard-won experience vanished from the force. The Americans, by contrast, rotated their skilled pilots home after a certain number of missions, allowing them to train new generations. The mathematics of this difference would compound relentlessly as the war progressed. But in June of 1942, this long-term consequence was not yet fully visible. What was immediately apparent was something more visceral and shocking. The myth of Japanese naval invincibility had cracked. Not shattered entirely, not yet, but cracked in a way that would only deepen with time. The planners and strategists and commanders who read the reports from Midway understood, or began to understand, that the war they had envisioned winning, in a relatively swift arc, might become something far more protracted and uncertain. And perhaps more disturbing still was the realization that American naval commanders, particularly in the person of Admiral Chester Nimitz, were proving to be thoughtful, adaptive, and willing to take calculated risks based on intelligence gathered from decoded Japanese radio communications. In the months that followed Midway, the Japanese Navy faced a profound strategic dilemma. Should they attempt to rebuild their carrier force and prepare for a climactic fleet engagement that might yet restore the balance? Or should they consolidate their holdings and prepare for a long defensive war? The answer, it turned out, would be neither entirely one nor the other, but rather a kind of exhausting oscillation between the two, a war of attrition that Japan could not ultimately win. The Americans, it seemed, could afford attrition. Japan could not. For officers like Koga, observing these developments from their shore commands and staff positions, the implications were becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. The war would not end quickly. The Americans would not be deterred by a single defeat. More ships would need to be built, more pilots trained, more resources allocated to a conflict that was beginning to take on the character of a grinding struggle rather than a swift campaign of conquest. And yet, and here lay the peculiar tragedy of Japan's position, the nation's resource base was actually shrinking rather than expanding. The submarines and surface raiders that were supposed to isolate the enemy and sever their supply lines were themselves being hunted and sunk at an accelerating rate. The very conquests that had seemed so glorious were now beginning to consume more resources to hold and defend than they yielded in strategic advantage. Midway, then, was not merely a single battle, no matter how dramatic or decisive. It was a threshold, a hinge point upon which the entire character of the Pacific War began to turn. After Midway, there were no more sustained offensive operations launched by the Japanese Navy. Instead, there was a slow, grinding retreat, sometimes defended with fierce determination, sometimes more hastily abandoned, but always a contraction rather than an expansion. The vast oceanic empire that had seemed so secure in the spring of 1942 would, over the next 3 years, shrink and shrivel until only a defensive perimeter remained around the Japanese home islands themselves. For Mineichi Koga, then in his mid-50s, and observing these shifts in the broader patterns of the war, the significance would have been clear. The Navy he had served all his life, the institution to which he had devoted his entire career, was entering a new and far more difficult phase. The enemy was adapting. Resources were becoming scarcer. The questions that commanders would need to ask themselves were no longer about how to extend Japan's victories further, but rather how to preserve what remained, how to maintain morale in the face of inevitable setbacks, and how to organize a defense that might, against all odds, exact such a high price from the enemy that a negotiated settlement might still be possible. It was a different kind of challenge entirely from the swift, aggressive operations of the first year of the war. It was a challenge that would test not only tactical skill, but also strategic patience, psychological resilience, and the ability to function effectively even as the broader circumstances of the conflict moved inexorably against you. On the morning of April 18, 1943, a small flotilla of twin-engine Mitsubishi G4M bombers lifted away from the airfield at Rabaul, their engines humming into the humid New Guinea sky. The planes banked northwestward toward Bougainville, where they were expected to rendezvous with a waiting escort of Zeros. Inside the lead aircraft sat Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, a man whose reputation had grown to almost mythic proportions throughout Japan's naval service. He was traveling to inspect bases in the Solomon Islands, a routine administrative journey of the sort he undertook periodically. Nothing in his itinerary suggested danger, nothing whispered of what was about to unfold. What Yamamoto did not know, what neither he nor his staff could have known, was that American intelligence had been reading his movements with extraordinary precision. The codebreakers at Pearl Harbor and in Melbourne had intercepted the radio traffic containing his flight plan, the exact times, the precise route his aircraft would follow. On that same morning, American P-38 fighter pilots were already climbing into their cockpits, their aircraft fueled and their orders clear. Find Admiral Yamamoto and destroy him. There is something peculiarly jarring about the collision of routine and catastrophe. At around 9:35 in the morning, the G4M bomber carrying Yamamoto descended through a scattered layer of clouds above the jungles of Bougainville. The escort Zeros were nearby, their pilots alert and watchful, and then, with a speed that left no time for evasion or prayer, the American fighters struck. What followed was not a battle but an execution. Within moments, Yamamoto's bomber was ablaze, spiraling downward through the tropical air. It crashed into the jungle below, and with it died one of Imperial Japan's most celebrated commanders, a man whose strategic mind had shaped the opening chapters of the Pacific War. The news, when it reached Japan and the offices of the Combined Fleet, arrived like a stone dropped into still water. The ripples spread outward through every level of command. Yamamoto had been far more than a military figure. He represented a continuity of vision, a living connection to the plans and ambitions that had guided the Navy since the outbreak of war. His death was not merely a loss of leadership, it was a rupture in the narrative that Japan's naval establishment had been telling itself about the course of the conflict. Those who served under him understood immediately that something fundamental had shifted. The shock was not simply emotional, though that was certainly present. It was the deeper shock of recognition that the war, which had begun with such brilliant tactical successes, had now reached a phase where even the most senior commanders were vulnerable to enemy action. If Yamamoto could be hunted down and killed while traveling within ostensibly secure waters, then what fortress was truly safe? What distance was truly far enough? In the weeks following the interception of Yamamoto's plane, the question that occupied the minds of Japan's naval leadership was simple but devastating. Who would now command the Combined Fleet? The structure of the Japanese Navy, with all its rigid hierarchies and factional alignments, did not allow for easy succession. There were other officers, certainly, men with distinguished records and considerable experience, but Yamamoto had cast a long shadow, and his replacement would inevitably be measured against him, found wanting in some aspect or another. The answer, when it came, fell upon the shoulders of Admiral Mineichi Koga. It was a choice that made logical sense within the context of naval seniority and experience. Koga was, by any measure, a qualified commander. He had served the Navy for nearly 50 years. He had held important positions, had demonstrated competence and discretion in his duties, had earned the respect of his peers through quiet, methodical service. Yet there was something about the transition that felt uncertain, almost hesitant. Yamamoto had been irreplaceable in his charisma and his grasp of modern naval strategy. Koga was solid, capable, but in a quieter register altogether. What no one could have anticipated, of course, was that Yamamoto's death would be followed, less than a year later, by Koga's own mysterious disappearance. But that lay ahead. hidden in the fog of war and the uncertainties of the future. For now, in the spring of 1943, the combined fleet had to adjust to the loss of its figurehead and accept the elevation of a man whose very competence made him seem less dazzling, less visionary, less like the architect of naval destiny that his predecessor had appeared to be. The ambient sounds of mourning were muted in the official channels, though privately, among officers who had known Yamamoto personally, there was a quiet devastation. This was a navy that had been built on the concept of honor and duty unto death, yet the death of one of its greatest commanders had come not through glorious battle, but through the prosaic fact of radio intercepts and timing. It was a kind of inglorious end for a man who had seemed to embody an older, nobler order of warfare. In a broader sense, Yamamoto's death marked a threshold. Japan's navy, which had entered the war with an aura of invincibility, began its slow descent into a struggle for mere survival. Each successive battle, each island lost, each carrier sunk, contributed to a growing sense that the balance had shifted irrevocably. The euphoria of the early months, the striking of Pearl Harbor, the rapid conquest of Southeast Asia, the seeming dominance of Japanese forces across the Pacific, had given way to a grimmer calculation of losses and attrition. Koga inherited a navy that was still numerous on paper, still possessed of considerable firepower, but increasingly hollowed out by the losses it had sustained. The pilots who had graduated from flight training in 1940 and 41 were largely gone, replaced by younger men with less thorough preparation for the demands of combat. The shipyards could replace some losses, but not at the rate the Americans were now producing vessels. Every material advantage Japan had possessed at the beginning of the war was now arrayed against it. The sober mood that descended through the naval hierarchy in the weeks after Yamamoto's death was, perhaps, the first clear acknowledgement that the course of the conflict could not be easily corrected by strategic brilliance or tactical innovation. It would require instead the kind of stoic acceptance of diminishing fortunes that the samurai code had long celebrated, though in theory, rather than in the daily grinding reality of naval command under American pressure. Koga stepped into this atmosphere of loss and uncertainty, carrying with him the weight of succession and the knowledge that he would be tested almost immediately by the realities of an enemy that showed no signs of slowing its advance across the Pacific. The telegram arrived in the spring of 1943, and with it came an inheritance no one would have chosen. Mineichi Koga, who had spent so much of his career in the measured shadows of administration and careful planning, was summoned to Tokyo to receive the most formidable and most fractured command in the entire Imperial Japanese Navy. He would replace Isoroku Yamamoto as Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, the supreme position, the one that had defined the war itself for the past 16 months. The timing, though inevitable, felt almost cruel in its weight. The ceremony was subdued. There were no grand celebrations, no public reassurances broadcast across the radio to a nation that desperately needed them. Koga understood, as every senior officer understood by that spring, that the moment of Japanese naval ascendancy had passed. The victories at Pearl Harbor, in the Indian Ocean, even the confident strikes against American shipping, seemed now to belong to another era, one already hardening into memory and myth. What remained was a fleet in the process of being systematically dismantled by forces that grew stronger with each passing month. Consider for a moment what Koga actually inherited. The Japanese Navy had lost Yamamoto himself, yes, but that was only the most visible wound. The larger hemorrhage was the steady attrition of ships and trained pilots across a Pacific that had become an American lake. At the Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942, the fleet had lost its first carriers. At Midway the following June, 4 irreplaceable fleet carriers went to the bottom, along with the vast majority of their air crews, men who could not simply be replaced the way steel hulls could, if even that were possible anymore. The psychological shock of those battles had never fully lifted. Officers who had grown accustomed to thinking of themselves as invincible now had to reckon with the fact that the American Navy not only refused to be defeated, but was growing stronger by the month. drawing on resources that seemed genuinely limitless. By the time Koga assumed command, Japan's shipyards were straining under the burden of replacing losses, while simultaneously trying to build new vessels to counter the expanding American fleet. The mathematics were grinding, relentless, and profoundly unfavorable. For every Japanese ship sunk, the Americans could replace it in a matter of months. For every Japanese pilot killed, and the losses were staggering, something in the neighborhood of 200 experienced naval aviators per month. By mid-1943, there was no equivalent replacement pool. Japan had exhausted its supply of experienced air crews. The men rising through the training pipeline were increasingly green, rushed through abbreviated training regimens in a desperate effort to put bodies in cockpits. They flew obsolete or obsolescent aircraft against American pilots who had the advantage of superior machines, superior tactics, and the confidence that came from winning. The geographic situation had deteriorated as well. The Japanese perimeter, which had expanded so dramatically in the early months of the war, was now contracting almost visibly. The American invasions of the Solomon Islands had pushed north from Guadalcanal throughout 1942 and into 1943. The Australians and Americans were pressing through New Guinea. The strategy that Japan had hoped would create an impregnable defensive sphere, what the military planners called the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, was being steadily compressed, squeezed inward by forces operating from multiple axes. Where could the Navy concentrate? Which threats were most critical? The question of how to defend an impossibly long perimeter against an enemy with seemingly infinite resources was the kind of strategic problem that could drive a commander to despair, and Koga was too intelligent not to see it clearly. Yet he accepted the post, as a Japanese officer of his generation accepted such things. Duty was duty. Honor demanded that one face even an impossible situation with dignity and with the full exercise of whatever skill and judgment one possessed. Koga moved to the flagship, the heavy cruiser Musashi, which had only recently returned from repairs. He gathered his staff around him, men who were, for the most part, as capable and as realistic as the officer corps could produce. Together they faced the fundamental question that would consume the remainder of the war: how to extract maximum value from a rapidly depleting fleet, while also maintaining the fiction, both for the government in Tokyo and for the men under his command, that Japan still had a strategy for victory. This was the peculiar agony of Koga's position. He had not been consulted about whether Japan should continue the war. That decision belonged to the politicians and to the military service branches as a whole. The Navy's role was to execute strategy, not to question whether that strategy remained feasible. And so Koga threw himself into the work of trying to salvage what could be salvaged, to organize and preserve the fleet's fighting power in the face of odds that grew more terrible with each passing week. What sort of man was he in this moment of terrible responsibility? Those who knew him during this period describe him as quiet, methodical, given to long silences and careful deliberation. He lacked Yamamoto's theatrical dash, his ability to inspire through sheer force of personality. He lacked as well Yamamoto's famous pessimism, the older admiral's blunt private assessments about Japan's ultimate inability to defeat the United States in a prolonged industrial war. Yet Koga was no optimist either. He was, rather, a realist, the kind of officer who looked at the facts before him and tried to find the best possible course of action within those constraints, without deceiving himself about what the constraints were. The question that would occupy him through the remainder of 1943 and into 1944 was one that had vexed Japanese naval planning from the beginning: where to concentrate the fleet's remaining strength. Should the Navy attempt to defend everywhere, knowing that such dispersion would guarantee defeat in detail? Should it instead withdraw to prepared positions closer to home, consolidating its forces and waiting for the Americans to come to it? Or was there some middle path, some way to husband resources while maintaining enough forward presence to contest American advances and make the enemy's expansion costly enough to affect their calculations? These were the kinds of questions Koga wrestled with as he assumed command of a navy that was, essentially, fighting a war of retreat, dressed up in the language of strategy and preparation. He had inherited not just a fleet, but a contradiction, ordered to maintain Japan's defensive sphere while possessing the means to do no such thing. It was perhaps the most demanding test of his entire career. From his headquarters at Truk, deep in the heart of the Central Pacific, Koga inherited not the glittering navy of legend, but a force consumed by the mathematics of attrition. The sprawling anchorage, ringed by coral islands and dense tropical vegetation, had become something between a fortress and a tomb, a place where the carefully arranged power of the Imperial Japanese Navy was slowly, inexorably being converted into ash and wreckage across 1,000 distant atolls. He understood, with the crystalline clarity that comes only to those who have spent decades studying naval strategy, that his primary mission was no longer to win, but to endure, to preserve, to stretch every remaining ounce of steel and fuel and human resolve across an ocean that seemed to grow wider with each passing month. The work was unglamorous. There were no heroic cavalry charges, no decisive battles fought and won in the span of a brilliant afternoon. Instead, there were fuel manifests and damage assessments, careful calculations about how many ships could be kept seaworthy, with the resources trickling in from home, decisions about which vessels would be preserved and which would be left to rot in the equatorial sun. Koga moved through the humid routine of his headquarters with the same methodical attention that had characterized his entire career, reading reports, consulting with his senior commanders, wrestling with the terrible arithmetic of naval strength. How many destroyers could be kept operational? Which cruisers had fuel enough for patrol duties? Where could pilots be assigned to maximum effect when the stockpiles of aviation fuel were dwindling faster than new supplies could reach them? These were the questions that consumed his days, small and technical but absolutely vital to the survival of whatever fighting force Japan still possessed. The islands of Truk itself presented a microcosm of the larger problem. Thousands of sailors and officers crowded into the anchorage, living in conditions that ranged from Spartan to squalid, their morale buoyed by the knowledge that they were still fighting, still defending their homeland, yet eroded by the constant awareness of what was happening beyond the horizon. Rumors of American advances filtered through the ranks despite all efforts at censorship, news of ships lost, island garrisons overrun, the slow and seemingly unstoppable march of enemy forces pushing westward. Koga recognized that morale was itself a form of ammunition, one that had to be carefully managed and replenished. He conducted inspections, spoke with officers and enlisted men, maintained the ceremonial and psychological rituals that held the traditional hierarchies of the fleet together, even as those hierarchies were becoming increasingly irrelevant to the basic fact of survival. The physical infrastructure of the base itself demanded constant attention. The docks were crowded with damaged vessels awaiting repair. The repair facilities were stretched to their absolute limits, working around the clock with inadequate materials and dwindling supplies of spare parts. Ships that might have been saved in earlier years now had to be cannibalized, their usable components removed and installed on vessels deemed more critical, the hulks left to rot in the lagoon as monuments to the Empire's decline. Aircraft came in damaged or requiring maintenance, and the shortage of replacement aircraft was so severe that sometimes they were simply patched and sent back out, their pilots knowing that in all likelihood, if they suffered damage in combat, there would be no replacement waiting for them. The loss of a plane was the loss of years of training, the loss of experience, the loss of a man who could never truly be replaced. Koga's strategy, if it could be called that, was one of conservation and delay. He issued orders to preserve the fleet in being, to avoid unnecessary engagement with superior American forces, to maintain the fleet's cohesion and readiness for the moment when, as some in Tokyo continued to insist, the Americans might become overextended and a final, decisive battle could be fought. It was a strategy born of desperation and hope, mingled together in equal measure, the desperate hope that somehow, against all odds, the tide might turn. Yet Koga, having observed Western navies, having studied American industrial capacity, and American resolve, cannot have fully believed this himself. He was too honest, too clear-eyed, but he carried out his duty because that was what officers did, because the alternative, capitulation, the acknowledgement that the war was lost, was unthinkable within the mental world in which he lived. The quiet, grinding work of fleet administration consumed him. Supply ships arrived less frequently than before. Each one that made it through represented a small victory against the increasingly effective American submarine blockade. Fuel oil, the lifeblood of any naval force, became the limiting factor in virtually every decision. Koga had to ration it, allocate it, choose which operations could be conducted and which would have to be postponed or abandoned altogether. To conduct a full-scale fleet operation meant burning through months of reserves in a matter of weeks. To remain at anchor, maintaining only the minimum patrols necessary to protect the base and keep watch for enemy movements, meant stretching those same supplies across seasons. He chose conservation, knowing that some in Tokyo, and in the fleet itself, might interpret this as timidity, as a failure of the warrior spirit. But Koga had spent too many years thinking about naval strategy to confuse gesture with substance, and there was no substance to a fleet that could fight for only a few weeks before running out of fuel. His relationship with the officers under him was complicated by this necessity for restraint. Some of the younger, more aggressive commanders chafed at his cautious approach, seeing in his methodical style an absence of the samurai spirit they believed should animate the fleet. Others, the pragmatists who understood the real situation as clearly as Koga himself, recognized that he was doing the only thing that could be done, maintaining order and function in the face of inevitable decline. The factions within the officer corps, never fully resolved despite years of bloody confrontation and purge, reasserted themselves in subtle ways. Koga had to manage these tensions as carefully as he managed fuel supplies and ship movements, knowing that any significant fracture in the command structure could accelerate the fleet's dissolution. The daily rhythms of the base continued despite everything: the morning calls to assembly, the evening contemplations, the small rituals that marked the passage of time and maintained the traditions of the service. Officers who had graduated from Etajima decades earlier still wore their dress uniforms to dinner, still maintained the forms and ceremonies that connected them to a navy that no longer truly existed except in memory. Koga participated in these rituals not out of nostalgia, but out of recognition that they served a purpose, that they held together the human bonds that were the only real strength a weakening navy possessed. When you could no longer rely on material superiority or numerical advantage, you had to rely on cohesion, on the willingness of men to fight and die for something larger than themselves. That willingness was fragile, and it had to be continually nourished. The war that Admiral Koga inherited was not fought in grand fleet engagements anymore, but rather in the suffocating daily mathematics of attrition, and there was no place where this truth became more palpable than in the lagoon at Truk, where the combined fleet now made its forward headquarters. The atoll itself, this vast natural harbour, ringed by coral and volcanic islands in the heart of Micronesia, had become both sanctuary and prison. Imagine, if you will, the weight of that tropical air in the early months of 1943, thick enough to feel as cloth against the skin, pressing down across the water each dawn with relentless constancy. The lagoon held perhaps 200 ships in its best days, anchored in careful geometric rows, their hulls reflecting the heat back into themselves, steel drums cooking in sunlight that never seemed to soften or forgive. The officers who served in those waters existed in a peculiar state of waiting. They were men conditioned by decades of Naval Academy discipline and samurai tradition to expect clarity of purpose, yet they found themselves instead in a holding pattern that tested their nerves in ways that battle, paradoxically, did not. There is a particular form of strain that comes from knowing danger is approaching, but not knowing precisely when it will arrive, and that knowledge sat heavy in the minds of every captain, every gunnery officer, every signalman watching the radio receivers. The routine, at least, provided some structure. Dawn general quarters came with the first real light, crews moving to their stations not because an attack was imminent, but because this was how discipline was maintained, how the illusion of readiness was preserved in an increasingly tenuous situation. The provisioning of such a fleet in those waters became a grinding concern that occupied the attention of supply officers and logistics staff in ways that rarely appeared in official dispatches. The ships themselves consumed enormous quantities of fuel oil, and as the war progressed and American submarines grew more effective, the tankers that might have brought fresh supplies from Japan became targets themselves, turning home ports into increasingly distant memories. What food did arrive came often in forms that tested the resilience of even experienced sailors. Rice, of course, remained the staple, but the quality degraded noticeably as the months wore on. Fresh vegetables arrived rarely, arriving by slow transport ships that had to run the gauntlet of interdiction, and so the men developed the hollow-eyed appearance of those subsisting on rations that sustained life, but not vigor. The tropical heat accelerated spoilage, and meat preserved in salt sat heavy in the stomach, on days when the thermometer climbed past 35 degrees Celsius, which was nearly every day. There was something peculiarly Japanese in how officers managed this declining standard of living, without complaint, at least not in any official manner. The tradition of gammon, the bearing of the unbearable with dignity, ran deep through the naval culture. Officers would eat the same diminished portions as enlisted men, or so the custom required, and this maintained a certain equilibrium of collective sacrifice. Yet there were also the subtle hierarchies that always emerge in closed communities, the ways that seniority and rank produced small advantages, a slightly larger cabin, priority in fresh water for bathing, the possibility of acquiring fruit or fish through the informal economy that always flourished in garrison towns. The younger sailors, the conscripted teenagers who had been swept into the Navy as the war consumed more and more of Japan's manpower, had no such cushions. They slept in hammocks strung in the hot gun turrets or engine rooms, sweat pooling in the creases of their uniforms, breathing air that had already passed through the lungs of dozens of other men before reaching them. The heat itself became almost a character in the story of daily life at Truk. Not merely the oppressive warmth that pressed down from above, but the reflective heat that rose from the lagoon, the trapped heat within the steel corridors and compartments of the ships, the heat that made steel ladders too hot to touch with bare skin in the afternoon, that caused paint to blister and crack, that turned the galley into something approaching an inferno during meal preparations. The engineers who worked below decks in the engine rooms and boiler rooms existed in a fundamentally different temperature regime than the men on the upper decks, and the question has been asked by historians whether their particular exhaustion and listlessness in those months was not merely the product of the heat, but also of something deeper, a physical manifestation of the Navy's sinking morale. One can only wonder what thoughts occupied their minds during those long, monotonous watches, the rhythmic thump of the engines, providing a hypnotic backdrop to contemplation of fates they could not control. The officers, those trained men who had spent years in the Naval Academy studying strategy and gunnery theory, occupied their time in ways that spoke to the peculiar sterility of their situation. Planning meetings took place in slightly less stifling conference rooms, maps spread across tables showing projected American movements and proposed Japanese counter-deployments. There was something almost theatrical in these sessions, the movement of markers representing fleet units across vast ocean distances, as if the pieces on the map maintained the autonomy and responsiveness that actual ships and men no longer possessed. Communications with Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo became increasingly fraught, carrying implicit criticisms and veiled requests for resources that everyone knew could not be provided. What ships could be spared from other theaters? How many replacement aircraft could be manufactured and ferried to the front? These questions hung unresolved, generating reports and counter-reports that accumulated in filing systems, while the reality on the water remained stubbornly unchanged. The enlisted men, when they had brief respite from duties, occupied themselves in the small diversions available to men confined to a lagoon in the middle of an ocean. There was gambling, inevitably, using stakes that ranged from cigarettes to letters from home, and the psychology of these games reflected something of their circumstances, the hope of sudden reversal, the fantasy that luck could provide what strategic brilliance could not. Letters were precious commodities, months old by the time they arrived, speaking of a Japan that was increasingly distant, carrying news of civilian air raids and rationing that made the sailors' own deprivations seem, in some paradoxical way, less isolating. They wrote their own letters in return, trying to convey normalcy to families who would read them weeks or months later, performing a strange temporal dance of communication across a failing empire. Some men carved small items from wood or bone, meager crafts that represented an assertion of human creativity against the machinery of warfare that surrounded them. Others simply sat on the lower decks when they could, conserving energy, becoming the human equivalent of ships in harbour, present but awaiting orders, present but not truly engaged. The officers and men existed, in those tropical months, in a state of suspension that was perhaps harder to endure than actual combat. In battle there was clarity, however brief, and the adrenaline of action could override the grinding anxiety of uncertainty. But in the waiting at Truk, there was only the knowledge that the American offensive was building somewhere beyond the horizon, that resources were depleting, that Japanese naval power was being measured in a lengthening list of losses across multiple theaters. Admiral Koga moved among them in those early weeks and months of his command, a lean figure in dress whites, his presence itself a kind of message about continuity, about the chain of command persisting, even as everything else seemed to be slowly dissolving into the tropical heat and humidity. What conversations passed between him and his subordinates, what private doubts he might have harbored, remains largely unrecorded, preserved perhaps only in the memories of men who would themselves become casualties or survivors of a war that no one at Truk in those months truly believed could be won. By the autumn of 1943, the war that Yamamoto had warned against was grinding toward its own terrible logic, and the American naval machine, wounded but far from beaten, had begun to coalesce into something far more formidable than the improvised offensive of the earlier campaigns. The naval battles that had consumed so much of Japan's irreplaceable pilot talent and its finest ships were no longer producing the victories they had once seemed to promise. Instead, they were leaving gaps in the fleet that could not be easily filled, and Koga found himself presiding over a navy that was learning, with each passing month, the mathematics of attrition. The Americans, working from island bases that grew ever closer to Japan's inner defensive perimeter, were no longer confined to sporadic raids or isolated engagements. Their strategy had become systematic, methodical, in a way that perhaps only an industrial democracy could sustain. They were not trying to win one decisive battle, a concept that still resonated deeply in Japanese naval thinking, but rather to accumulate advantages, to push forward yard by yard across vast stretches of ocean, securing airfields and supply depots, building a network of support that allowed them to strike deeper with each successive wave. From his headquarters at Truk, which served as the pivot point for Japanese naval operations in the Central Pacific, Koga could observe this tightening, this slow constriction of Japanese-held territory that, once begun, seemed almost impossible to reverse. The news from various sectors grew progressively grimmer. Islands that had been thought to be securely held fell to American assault. Supply ships bound for forward outposts failed to arrive. Reconnaissance flights reported American task forces appearing in waters that had previously felt relatively safe, their numbers growing with a consistency that spoke to seemingly inexhaustible reserves of men and material. It was in response to this deteriorating situation that Koga and his planning staff began to formulate what became known as Plan Z, a naval strategy born not out of confident expectation, but out of the recognition that Japan's strategic options were narrowing with each passing week. The plan represented something of a paradox. It was simultaneously ambitious in its conception and born from a deepening desperation about the Navy's ability to wage an offensive war. The fundamental idea was to establish a series of defensive lines in the Pacific, each one constituted by strong naval forces positioned so that an attacking American fleet would be forced to fight under less favorable conditions, perhaps attrited and weakened enough that Japan could then mount a counteroffensive. The elegance of this approach, such as it was, lay in the hope that by carefully choosing the terrain and the position, by forcing the American advance to follow a path that Japan could predict and prepare for, the declining Japanese fleet might yet achieve something approximating parity in a decisive engagement. It echoed, in certain respects, the older doctrine of the decisive battle, the Kantai Kessen, that had so long animated Japanese naval thought, but with the crucial difference that this version would take place under far less advantageous circumstances. To implement such a plan, however, required something that was becoming increasingly difficult to achieve: coordination across immense distances, communication between scattered squadrons, the movement and concentration of forces that had to be drawn from 100 different stations and supply lines. The Pacific Ocean, which had once seemed so large that Japan could operate with reasonable security within its vastness, had somehow become too small. Every position that was thought to be secure was now potentially vulnerable to American aircraft appearing from unexpected quarters. Every concentration of ships invited air attack. The very process of massing forces for a defensive line seemed almost certain to invite the catastrophe one was trying to prevent. Koga understood, with a clarity that perhaps not all of his contemporaries fully grasped, that the implementation of Plan Z depended on factors that lay increasingly beyond Japan's control. It required that American commanders cooperate, in a sense, by advancing along predictable routes and attacking where Japan had chosen to make its stand. It required that Japanese forces, scattered across an enormous expanse of ocean, be able to communicate clearly with one another, despite increasingly unreliable radio conditions and the constant threat of American surveillance. It required, perhaps most crucially, that the supply lines holding together the entire apparatus continue to function even as American submarines and aircraft chipped away at them with relentless persistence. The practical difficulties of simply keeping a fleet in fighting condition across such distances were themselves staggering. Fuel oil, which was essential for moving ships and training pilots, had to be brought from the Dutch East Indies through waters that were growing progressively more dangerous. Replacement aircraft had to be manufactured in Japan and transported across oceanic distances while facing American opposition. Fresh pilots, trained to the standard that Japanese naval aviation demanded, were harder and harder to produce as losses mounted and training facilities themselves came under attack. Food and medicine and ammunition and spare parts for every conceivable piece of equipment had to flow through supply chains that were themselves targets. Koga's role in all of this was that of a commander trying to work within constraints that seemed to grow tighter with each passing day. He was not the kind of officer to make grand pronouncements or to attempt to inspire through rhetoric. Instead, he worked quietly through his staff, examining charts, considering possibilities, trying to imagine how the Americans might move and how Japan might position itself to meet them. There was something almost ascetic about his approach, a willingness to accept harsh truths about Japan's position, while simultaneously looking for the narrow paths through which action might still be possible. The great irony, which would have been apparent to anyone studying the situation with cold clarity, was that Plan Z might have been workable in an earlier stage of the war, when Japan still possessed the pilot talent, the ships, and the industrial capacity to execute such a complex maneuver. By the time Koga was attempting to put the plan into effect, the very preconditions for its success were already dissolving. The American Navy was growing stronger month by month, while Japanese strength continued to decline. The interval during which something like Plan Z might have been decisive was narrowing toward invisibility. Yet what else was there to do? The alternative was passive resignation, the acceptance that the war was lost, and that nothing remained but to manage the inevitable defeat. That was never seriously considered in the councils of the Japanese fleet. There was always another plan, another calculation, another strategic arrangement that might yet change the mathematics of the war. It was this combination of clear-eyed realism about Japan's difficulties and a stubborn refusal to acknowledge ultimate defeat that characterized the senior command structure that Koga now led. The distances involved in trying to coordinate such an enormous theater were themselves almost incomprehensible to those not engaged in naval operations. From Truk to the Philippines might be 1,000 miles. From the Philippines to Japanese home waters was another vast stretch of ocean. The American offensive, by contrast, was building itself outward from a series of points, island bases growing closer to Japan with each American success, that served as anchors for a progressively expanding web of operations. It was asymmetrical in the way that perhaps only a navy could understand. Japan was trying to defend a vast area with decreasing strength, while America was trying to attack that area with increasing strength, and the two forces were moving in precisely opposite directions along every graph that mattered. The human element of command in such circumstances cannot be understated. Koga was communicating with subordinates whom he might never meet in person, issuing orders that would take days to reach their destinations and weeks to be properly implemented. He was working with information that was always at least partially out of date, trying to make strategic decisions based on intelligence that had been gathered days or even weeks before. It was a form of command that placed extraordinary burdens on the judgment and the character of the man at the center. One false decision, one miscalculation about where the Americans would strike, one overestimation of Japan's ability to concentrate forces in time, could result in catastrophic losses that the Navy could not afford. And yet, through all of this, Koga maintained his methodical temperament, his quiet resolve, his unwillingness to be swept up in either the despair that some officers felt or the irrational optimism that others clung to. He was, in a sense, holding the line for rationality in an increasingly irrational situation, trying to do what could be done with the forces available while being grimly honest about what could not be done. Whether such an approach could ultimately have changed the outcome of the war was perhaps a question that was already answered even as he asked it, but the attempt itself was all that remained. Yet on the morning of March 31st, 1944, the careful machinery of command that Koga had been rebuilding from Truk faced an interruption that would never be resolved. A storm had been gathering across the Pacific, the kind of tempest that rose without much warning in those waters, and Koga made the decision to relocate his headquarters. The Americans were pressing closer with each passing week, and Truk, however well fortified, had begun to feel increasingly exposed. He would fly to Palau, further south and west, to establish new command facilities there. It was a reasonable decision, made by a man accustomed to weighing risk and logistics with a cool, methodical mind. 2 flying boats were prepared for the journey on the morning of the 31st. They were Kawanishi H-8K aircraft, large 4-engine seaplanes, among the finest the Imperial Navy possessed. Koga would travel in one, his chief of staff Captain Shoji Matsushita in the other, their aircraft carrying not only the Admiral himself, but sensitive documents detailing Japanese naval strategy, operational plans, and intelligence assessments. Both planes lifted from the calm waters of Truk Lagoon in the early hours, heading southwest toward Palau. They had a journey of perhaps 3 hours ahead of them, across open ocean, under a sky that seemed to promise fair enough weather, at least for the moment. But the weather turned. What witnesses would later describe as a sudden and violent storm materialized with little warning, the kind of rapid squall that could seem almost deliberate in its timing, as if the sea itself had conspired against the journey. The clouds darkened, rain swept across the wings. The pilots radioed back to Truk, reporting difficult conditions but pressing forward. They were professional men, experienced in these waters and these machines. They had crossed this route before. There was no reason to believe this morning would be any different from the others. Koga's aircraft, the lead plane, simply vanished from communication. The trailing aircraft, carrying Matsushita, struggled through the turbulence and eventually broke through to clearer weather, managing to complete the journey to Palau. But Koga's flying boat never arrived. Hours passed. Search vessels were dispatched from Truk, fanning out across the waters where the aircraft should have been flying. The sea was empty. Day after day, the searches continued, methodical sweeps of the ocean conducted by destroyers and patrol boats, scanning for debris, for wreckage, for any sign of the admiral and his crew. Nothing surfaced. The storm, it seemed, had simply taken them. News of the disappearance rippled through the Japanese fleet with a peculiar gravity. Yamamoto had been ambushed, targeted, his aircraft shot down by American fighters, a dramatic end befitting a man of his stature. But Koga vanished without drama, without enemy action, simply lost to the sea and the sky, in a moment of weather that had seemed almost routine. Dispatches were sent up the chain of command. Tokyo was informed. The loss was official, though the actual circumstances remained murky, suspended in uncertainty. For nearly a week, there was hope that somehow Koga might have survived, that he might be adrift on an island waiting for rescue, that this was merely a temporary absence rather than a death. But no rescue came. No signal fires were spotted. The silence deepened. The question that has haunted historians for 8 decades is whether Koga's disappearance was truly an accident, a storm that took an aircraft on an ordinary morning, or whether something more deliberate lay beneath the official account. There were murmurs, even then, that suggested alternative possibilities. Some sources suggested the aircraft had been intercepted by American fighters, that what was reported as weather was perhaps a cover for a combat loss that was too sensitive to acknowledge openly. Others wondered, quietly and carefully, whether internal factional rivalries within the Japanese military had played a hand, whether there were officers who benefited from Koga's removal and whose interests might have been served by his death. These theories have persisted in the decades since, floating through historical archives and scholarly debates, impossible to confirm, equally impossible to entirely dismiss. What we know with certainty is this: the storm was real. Weather reports from that day confirm that squalls did indeed sweep the area where the aircraft was flying. The radio messages from the pilots reporting difficult conditions have been documented. The aircraft did not arrive at Palau. A man and his crew, men whose names and faces have mostly faded into the particulars of military records, were lost that morning. Among them was an admiral who had spent his entire adult life in service to a navy that was consuming itself in a war he had privately doubted. A man who had been given command of a fleet that was already, in many ways, defeated, and asked to somehow restore it to fighting capability. What he might have accomplished had he survived, what strategies he might have employed in the months that followed, these are questions that history cannot answer. The Japanese Navy officially recorded his death by drowning, lost at sea during an air journey. His family received the formal notifications that such a loss entailed, though even those notifications were hedged with the peculiar vagueness that Japanese military bureaucracy seemed to favor in such matters. His replacement was named within days, Admiral Soemu Toyoda, who would inherit the same weakened fleet, the same impossible strategic situation, the same knowledge that the war had already turned toward defeat. Koga's papers, or at least the significant ones, were recovered eventually, washed up on beaches, or found among the few pieces of wreckage that were located. They provided insights into his thinking in those final months, his growing awareness of the Navy's deteriorating position, his attempts to construct some kind of unified strategy against an American offensive that seemed to gather strength with each passing month. But Koga himself remained suspended in that March morning, in that storm, in the moment when 2 flying boats lifted from Truk Lagoon, and one of them simply failed to emerge into whatever sky might have lay beyond the clouds. Was it simple chance, the random cruelty of weather at sea? Or was it something else entirely, something that records have never quite clarified and memories have never quite solidified into certainty? The ocean has kept its secrets, and perhaps they were never meant to be fully known. And yet, when we ask today who led Japan's combined fleet during the final, desperate years of the Pacific War, most voices fall silent. Yamamoto lives in memory, the brilliant strategist, the man who warned against American industrial might, the admiral whose aircraft fell burning over Bougainville. His name carries weight. His face appears in photographs and documentaries. But Mineichi Koga, the man who inherited his command, who guided what remained of the Imperial Navy through its darkest chapter, has become something closer to a shadow with a rank and a date of death, but precious little more. This forgetting was not accidental. It was shaped by forces that had little to do with Koga's actual competence or his burden, and everything to do with how war gets remembered, how victors write history, and how propaganda calcifies into what we believe to be fact. Consider first the matter of timing. Yamamoto died at the moment of Japan's shift from hope to fear. In April 1943, the war was not yet lost, though its trajectory had begun to bend unmistakably downward. There remained, in the Japanese imagination and in the minds of Allied commanders, the possibility of a dramatic reversal. The death of Yamamoto seemed to confirm what many had begun to whisper, that Japan had lost not merely a battle, but the man most capable of winning the war. His death was symbolically catastrophic. It felt like the moment something essential died. Koga inherited a navy that was already in mourning, already shaped by the certainty of decline. There was no honeymoon period, no moment of strategic hope to cement his reputation. He arrived as caretaker of a collapsing system. But perhaps more importantly, Koga died in obscurity, in a storm, in an aircraft that was never found with certainty. There is power in such a death, a kind of haunting quality. Yet there is also ambiguity, a cloud that refuses to lift. Yamamoto's death was witnessed, recorded, avenged in the American narrative. His aircraft was shot down. There were photographs and reports and medals awarded to the American pilots who killed him. His death became a story that could be told with clarity and closure. Koga's death was reported, investigated, but never truly confirmed with the satisfying finality that Western memory requires. He may have died in a storm. He may have been captured. Some whispered, even then, that he had survived, that he lived on in some island garrison, though these were phantoms, rumors born from the fog of war's ending. The Japanese remembered him, of course, in their immediate post-war period. Officers who had served under him wrote memoirs. Naval historians noted his tenure and his efforts. But even within Japan, as the decades wore on, the focus of memory narrowed. The war itself became harder to speak of openly. The occupation, the American military presence, the reshaping of Japanese society, all of this created a strange dynamic where the Navy's last commanders seemed almost to belong to a foreign nation, a destroyed world that few wished to visit in memory. Yamamoto, by contrast, had died before Japan's absolute defeat. He belonged to a different narrative arc, one that could be mourned and discussed without opening wounds about the war's end and all that followed it. And then there was the matter of American historiography, which cannot be set aside. The American narrative of the Pacific War was built around certain key figures and turning points. Yamamoto was known to American intelligence. He had been a military attaché in America. There was a sense in which American officers felt they had known him, had measured themselves against him. When he died, it meant something in that particular conversation. Koga was less known, less exotic, less amenable to the dramatic telling. The American war narrative emphasized the island campaigns, the air battles, the industrial superiority that crushed Japanese resistance. The story of what happened within the Japanese Navy as it declined was less compelling to audiences who wanted triumph, not the slow watching of an enemy's exhaustion. Consider how propaganda works in war and how its effects linger. During the conflict itself, both sides manufactured narratives designed to sustain morale or demoralize opponents. The death of Yamamoto was presented by America as a triumph, a stroke against Japan's leadership. The death was celebrated, weaponized, turned into evidence of American superiority. In Japan, by contrast, Yamamoto's death was controlled information, disclosed carefully, managed for its psychological impact. When Koga died, there was less interest in this kind of propaganda work. The war's outcome was already determined in the minds of informed observers. There was no glory to be extracted from managing his death's narrative. It simply happened, in the confusion and chaos of a losing nation, and was filed away. Then there is the simple, powerful fact that Koga left behind no great strategic innovation or memorable utterance to echo through time. Yamamoto is remembered, in part, because of his famous line about waking a sleeping giant. That sentence crystallizes something. It is quotable. It reveals foresight and philosophical depth. Koga was methodical, conservative, competent. He did not issue prophecies. He did not leave behind the kind of aphorism that students of war like to repeat. His value lay in his steadiness, his effort to preserve what could be preserved, his acceptance of an untenable position, and his attempt to manage it with dignity. These are admirable qualities, but they do not make for memorable history. We tend to remember the dramatic and the doomed, not the merely competent in the face of inevitable defeat. There is also something subtly melancholy in Koga's own nature that may have contributed to this erasure. Yamamoto had charisma, a quality that attracted biographers and storytellers. Koga was quiet, introspective, cautious. He did not seek attention or advancement through self-promotion. He served because it was his duty, not because he burned to be remembered. In a strange way, his humility, which was admirable in life, has become a kind of disadvantage in death. The historical record tends to favor those who demand attention, who shaped their own narratives even as they shaped events. Koga did neither. And perhaps, most importantly, there is the nature of loss itself. Yamamoto's death came when Japan still had resources to deploy, still had strategic options to consider. His passing could be mourned as a tragedy, the loss of the one man who might have found a way through the maze. Koga's death came when Japan was already committed to endurance, already past the point of strategic pivot. His death changed nothing. The war continued without him, would have continued regardless. There is no counterfactual in which Koga's survival leads to a different outcome, and history does not linger long over deaths that alter nothing. We remember the deaths that feel like they might have changed everything. We forget the deaths that merely confirm what we already knew, that this ship was sinking, and no one, no matter how skilled or determined, could have stopped it. Koga faded because he died at the moment when death had begun to seem ordinary, because his end was unclear, because he asked nothing of memory, and the world has honored that request, because the war had moved on before he left it, because he was steady and reasonable in an era remembered for its extremes, because Yamamoto's shadow, once cast, never truly lifted, and there was room, in the historical imagination, for only one great Japanese admiral. But in fading, he has become something else entirely, not a forgotten commander, but a kind of mirror, a reflection of all the capable, dedicated people who did their duty in losing causes, who managed collapse with quiet grace, who asked only to serve well in an age when service led to nothing but ash. Perhaps that is a kind of immortality too, though it is not the kind that names are given to. When we consider the life of Mineichi Koga in the long shadow of what came after, something becomes quietly apparent. He was a man who asked nothing of history except to serve the navy to which he had given everything, and it was perhaps his greatest and most human misfortune that history had little room left for men like him by the time his moment arrived. There is a peculiar loneliness to the position he inherited. Yamamoto's death had not merely removed a brilliant strategist from the board of war, it had also removed something more elusive, a figure around whom the Japanese naval imagination had crystallized, a man whose name carried weight even in whispers. Koga, by contrast, arrived at the helm of a ship that was already listing, and the currents of his command were not of his own making. He did not choose to become commander-in-chief. The combination of fate, attrition, and the relentless mathematics of naval warfare simply placed the burden upon his shoulders, and he carried it with the resignation of someone who understood that duty does not ask before it descends. In the months when he stood at Truk, watching the horizons for American task forces, Koga embodied something that the Western imagination has always struggled to fully comprehend about Japanese military culture, not the fanaticism that newspapers would later seize upon, but rather a kind of austere acceptance. The acceptance that one might work meticulously toward outcomes one could not ultimately control, that one might think clearly about strategic realities while remaining bound to orders and loyalty. That duty and private doubt could exist simultaneously, without contradiction, in the same human mind. What is it that separates a remembered leader from a forgotten one? The answer is often simpler and more melancholy than we might wish. Timing plays its role. Yamamoto had the grace, if it can be called grace, to meet his end, while Japan's narrative was still ascending, when his death could be cast as tragedy in a war that Japan still imagined it might win. Koga fell from the sky in an ordinary squall, at a moment when the outcome was no longer ambiguous to anyone paying close attention. There is no romance in becoming a casualty when defeat has already begun to seem inevitable. History is written by those who shape the meaning of events as they unfold, and Koga had no biographers ready, no mythology assembled, no carefully cultivated image waiting to be mourned. Yet there is something worth honoring in this very obscurity. Koga never sought the spotlight. He was a man who preferred to understand problems thoroughly before speaking, who believed that a fleet commander's duty was to preserve his forces intelligently rather than to spend them in the grand gestures that would make fine print in newspapers. In an age of certainty, he carried doubt. These qualities made him less visible in his own time and have rendered him nearly invisible now. But what remains, if we listen carefully, is the portrait of a human being navigating impossible circumstances with integrity. Koga did not invent the strategies that failed. He did not decide that Japan would go to war with an industrial giant while possessing insufficient resources to sustain that conflict. He inherited catastrophe and managed it as competently as anyone could have managed catastrophe. And then he vanished into a tropical storm, leaving behind only records and the fading memories of those who served under him. There is a meditation to be drawn from this, one that becomes clearer as we move further from the event itself. We tend to remember the figures who command the loudest voice, whose personalities dominate the record, whose deaths unfold on stages bright enough for the world to witness. But the work of leadership is often quieter than this. It is done in offices and aboard ships, in memoranda and conversations, in the small decisions that preserve morale and maintain order when everything else is dissolving. Koga was a man of this quieter tradition. And perhaps that is why he has been forgotten, and perhaps that is also why there is something oddly liberating in his obscurity. Think of what we know and what we do not know about him. We know the arc of his career, the stations he occupied, the general outlines of his final days. But we do not know with certainty how he felt in the darkness, what he said to those closest to him about the war's prospects, whether he experienced fear or only duty in those final moments in the aircraft. There is a kind of peace in this unknowing, is there not? The details of his inner life remain mercifully his own, and perhaps that is fitting. A man who believed in discipline and service, who saw his role as one of function rather than celebrity, might have appreciated knowing that his legacy would not be built on speculation about his private thoughts or his emotional interior. Instead, it would rest, if it rested anywhere, on the simple fact of his competence, on the record of a career well conducted, on the quiet respect of those who served under him and knew him to be fair and thoughtful, on the knowledge that he did what was asked of him when it was asked of him, and did it as well as circumstances allowed. The Pacific stretches on, much as it always has. The waves that once carried the ships under Koga's command continue to move and turn with ancient rhythms. The storms that swept his aircraft into the sea and into history's margins still rise and fall according to laws that care nothing for human rank or achievement. The islands of the Philippines and Truk still stand. The descendants of those who fought there have long since turned to their own lives, their own children, their own questions about honor and duty and the uses of memory. And somewhere in the vast archipelago of forgotten events and forgotten figures, Mineichi Koga remains, not important perhaps, by the standards that we usually apply to importance, but real. A man who lived and worked and died in service to something he believed in, even when the contours of that belief became increasingly difficult to sustain, even when the weight of evidence suggested that the cause he served was in its final, declining hours. He remained at his post. He did his duty. He accepted what came. In the end, there is a kind of nobility in this that requires no embellishment and no grand narrative. It is the nobility of the ordinary professional, the person who masters their craft and performs their function without needing to be mythologized in order to matter. History may not remember his name. History, in fact, largely has not. But the work he did, the steadiness he brought to an impossible position, the decency he extended to those under his command, these things existed. They mattered to the people who lived through them. And in their mattering, they leave a kind of echo that reverberates even now, even if only in the careful attention of those who take the time to listen. The tides of history are indifferent to whether we are remembered or forgotten. They carry us all in their currents, and then release us into depths where fame and obscurity become distinctions too small to measure. But while we are here, while we have the capacity to act and to choose, we might consider what Koga embodied, the possibility of serving well even when success becomes uncertain, the strength it takes not to shout about what you are doing, but simply to do it, carefully and without fanfare. The peculiar courage of someone who does not need an audience in order to be excellent. These are the thoughts that accompany the figure of Mineichi Koga as he recedes into the distance, his ship vanishing into storm, his name fading into the catalogue of those the world has overlooked. And perhaps, as your own thoughts begin to drift toward their rest, you might hold something of this in mind, the quiet satisfaction of work well done, the peace that comes from accepting what we cannot change, while doing what we can, with full attention and care. The understanding that not everything that matters requires monuments to prove its worth. Some things matter in the spaces between the noise of history, in the stillness of focused effort and genuine duty. Some things matter most precisely because they ask for nothing in return but the simple fact of their being done.